appeal PPA-400-2147, the first part of the hearing for that appeal. I think everyone here is very aware of the procedures for a hearing, and I recognise Mr. McCorriston from West Lothian Council. I recognise Mr. Irving. I recognise Mr. Watson from West Lothian Council, and I recognise Mr. Salter and Mr. MacLeod. And I don't recognise the other gentleman with you. Is that Peter Carroll?
Yes. Hi, good morning.
Good morning, yeah. Good. Okay. What I've done is, so this is the hearing on housing land supply and related policy matters, and what I've done with the agenda is that I've simply grouped the. You'll have seen from the questions that I asked, which you responded to in your hearing statements, that they were grouped under headings, and I've essentially kept those headings. And what I wanted to do was, they're almost the same as they were in the hearing statement, with the exception that I've swapped the order of the first two headings. So I would like to go first to method for calculating what the required effective housing land supply is, or 5-year effective housing land supply is. And I've slightly changed that to make a reference to the 5-year effective housing land supply specifically. And I've also added a 6th question to this first part of the agenda relating to NPF4. Has everyone got a copy of the agenda? Sorry, I should have asked first. Yeah, good. Yeah. Okay. And the way I was proposing to run the hearing was simply that, with one exception, I would ask parties to respond to the hearing statement of the other side, the opposing side, under that heading orally. Is everyone happy with that approach? And then we can move on to a discussion on each agenda item. Is everyone happy with that approach? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Good. Okay. Perhaps I did say I recognised all of you, but perhaps we could just say before we start what everyone is speaking to in particular. Maybe Mr. MacLeod, if you go first.
Thanks, sir. So I think from our perspective, Mr. Salter and I will probably do a bit of a double act on housing land supply issues generally. Mr. Carris is here. He is a qualified planner, but he is here primarily as a representative of the appellant, and I think we'll probably address issues related to effectiveness so far as required, but may obviously chip in if he feels that there is something that needs to be said about more general planning issues.
Good. Okay. Right. And Mr. who's speaking? Who's presenting West Lothian's case in particular?
Yeah. Good morning, sir. Craig McCorriston. So I'll be presenting the majority of the council's position on land supply issues, supported by Tony Irving and Matthew Watson in doing that, but principally myself on land supply issues, sir.
Right.
And then as we go into some of the more sort of detailed policy considerations, then that will be principally Matthew Watson who's leading on that. But again, it'll be a bit of a double or triple act, but that's broadly the intention, sir.
Okay, right. Good. So is everyone happy should we make a start on the first question? Does anyone have anything else at this stage? Anything I've forgotten?
I'm happy to.
We're good to start? Okay. So the first agenda item was the method for calculating whether there is a 5-year effective housing land supply. And I've changed this from sufficient effective housing land supply to 5-year effective housing land supply. And I did have a question to start off with before the parties present their cases, which would hopefully cut through some of the discussion on it. And that's in relation to the appellant's response to my question 1, on the, which isn't actually, which was, the reporter understands parties to be agreed that it's not possible to determine the 5-year effective housing land supply because CES Plan's housing target runs only to 31 March 2024. And the appellant gave a reply which I think misunderstood the question, which was simply to refer to the housing land audit as the 5-year effective housing, as showing the 5-year effective housing land supply. And what I'd intended by that question was a reference back to CES Plan Policy 7 and West Lothian Local Development Plan Policy HOU 2. And both of those policies refer to, well, in CES Plan Policy 7, it requires that housing may be granted permission on greenfield land to maintain a 5 years effective housing land supply, subject to a number of criteria. And in WLLDP Policy HOU 2, it sets out that where additional sites are needed to maintain a 5-year, that greenfield sites may be released where additional sites are needed to maintain a 5-year effective housing land supply. And it's that part of it's that question raised by policy that I wanted parties to address. So whether there is a 5-year effective housing land supply in terms of the policy, whether it's being maintained. See what I mean? It seems to me, and you maybe correct me if I'm wrong, that there's 2 parts to assessing whether there's a 5-year effective housing land supply, whether it's being maintained. One part is an assessment of the amount of housing that there is, the amount of housing land, that within 5 years will be free of constraints. And that's measured by the housing land audit, or at least it's programmed to come forward in 5 years. Perhaps that's a better way of putting it. And I don't understand the appellant to be questioning the figure in the housing land audit that you quoted to me. And I think if it's helpful just to make the distinction, perhaps we can just refer to that part of the 5-year supply as the audited supply. And the other part is the amount of land required for there to be a 5-year effective housing land supply. So the requirement, if you like. So that's if we can call that for the remainder of this hearing the 5-year requirement, that would be, so we're distinguishing the audited supply part from the 5-year requirement, and they have to be compared to see if there's if a 5-year effective housing land supply is being maintained, as I understand it in terms of the policy. So that's what he had in mind when I asked the first question. And really all I wanted to know was whether a figure can be given at all for that part, for a precise figure can be given for how much of an effective housing land supply there was, in terms of that kind of calculation. Well, I understand the appellant's argument that there's another way of doing things, but I thought that both parties were agreed that you couldn't simply sit down and say, here's the audited supply, here's the 5-year requirement, here's the amount that's, there's the answer to whether it's being maintained or not. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I do, sir. And apologies if we clearly didn't misinterpret the question that you were asking to begin with. The way that we look at it is take a step back from all of this. What is the purpose of the plan? Because fundamentally, understand the purpose of the policies and the way that the policies should be applied now. You need to understand the purpose of the plan. The purpose of the plan.
Before we go there, Mr. McLeod, I understand that, but you're agreed that there isn't a figure for the 5-year effective housing land supply.
Well, again, sir, Apologies.
It's not. I mean, if you don't have, if you have a figure for the 5-year effective housing land supply calculation in the way that I've said, it's not in your evidence. It's not in your housing land statement. You've given a figure for a 3-year effective housing land supply. You've shown how you've calculated it, but you haven't given a figure for a 5-year effective housing land supply.
Perhaps the easiest way to look at it, sir, is to think of it as an equation. There are two sides to it. One is the supply side, one is the demand side. Now, let's go back to the debate about residual and average. On day one of the plan, 5-year land requirement, as I think you've described it, 5-year land requirement is the same whether you use the residual or the average method. Because on day one of the plan, you should be able to see that if the plan is 12 years long, that every 12th is the same, and you should be able to see that amount of land, effective land, is in the supply and is likely to come forward to keep pace with the requirements of the plan. The debate then changes as one goes through the plan, and the appellant's position and the position of every reporter in West Lothian that has taken a decision on this case, on this issue, is that the residual methodology is the appropriate one to use. And the reason for that is, again, to ensure that 5-year effective supply, the amount of land on the supply side, is likely to be enough to deliver the requirement by the end of the plan. Where we're at the moment is an unusual position, because I think everyone had hoped that, everyone had hoped that the land supply would have delivered enough to meet the housing land requirement, which is the overall purpose of the plan. I think everyone had probably hoped that the LDP would be replaced by now with something else. Now, that hasn't happened.
And cess plan, no doubt.
Indeed, yes. Where we say we are is in the same place, which is the object of the plan is to ensure delivery of the housing land requirement. Housing land requirement, whether there's 5 years, 4 years, 3 years, housing land requirement remains immutable. That is a number that is to be delivered by the end of the plan period. We say if it can't be delivered by the end of the plan period, you don't just shrug your shoulders and say, well, there's nothing more I can do about it. What you do is you try and deliver it as quickly as possible. And so that's a roundabout way of telling you that the answer to the question you posed is the 5-year land requirement is the residual requirement of the plan, i.e. the number of houses that have not been built and are not projected to be built by 2024.
So essentially, just to go back to my question, so you're saying that you're referring back to the method that you set out in the housing land supply statement. So you're not you don't have 5-year effective housing land supply worked out in the way that you work out the 3-year effective housing land supply that you put in your housing land supply statement.
Well, we do have a number that we say needs to be achieved, and that can be found in paragraph 2.111.
2.111 of your appeal statement?
Of the hearing statement, sorry, sir.
Of your hearing statement.
So what we say there is if one considers the full effective housing land supply of 9,040 homes that the council predicts will be built by 2026 and compares that against the housing land requirement, 11,874 homes to 2024, there's a substantial shortfall of 2,833 homes. So we say that is the shortfall. 2833.
In the 5-year effective housing land supply.
If you compare the 5-year effective housing land, the audited supply against the remaining housing land requirement, then that is the shortfall that emerges then.
Why should I do that?
Well, the reason for that is that the object of the plan is to ensure delivery of the housing land requirement that the plan has set out. Although we don't have 5 years left of the plan, as I said, it doesn't mean that we abandon all hope and ignore the figure that's in the LDP. What the LDP requires is sufficient effective land over the next 5 years in order to meet the plan's requirement. Now, as I said at the beginning of the plan, that's a straightforward exercise. You simply look and you predict whether, on average, you're likely to have enough land coming forward in the next 5 years to deliver the requirement by the end.
But isn't the problem? I think I'll let the council come in a moment. But I suppose just one last question on this: isn't the problem that 5 years goes beyond the end of the plan?
Well, let me look at it, or let me put it to a different way, sir. In September 2018, Scottish ministers reluctantly allowed the local development plan to be approved. And I say reluctantly because it's clear from the direction that they issued that they did not feel that the council had done enough by way of allocation in its plan. The ministers issued a direction to the council that said, in fact, it's maybe worth not there. Let's have a quick look at the actual wording of it. So it's document MH 2.09. And what the ministers did in September 2018, I'll just wait until you've had that.
Yeah, I've got that.
Yeah. In September 2018, the ministers required the council to publish its action programme on a yearly basis. Now, as we understand it, that is unique in Scotland. And the reason that the ministers asked the council to do that was in response to the significant housing land shortfall identified through the examination process. The minister said that it demonstrated to him that the plan was out of step with the ambition and policy of the Scottish Government to deliver the homes that people need now and in the future as a priority. It's my view that West Lothian Council must do more to address the delivery of housing in its area. My expectation is that by updating and republishing the action programme annually, a more regular and active process for monitoring the allocated land and progressing delivery will be achieved. Now, the reason for referring to that is that was only 6 months before March 2019, which is 5 years before the end of the plan period. If you follow through the logic, I think your question, implicit in your question, sir, is, well, why should you focus on the 2024 requirement when we're less than 5 years from the end of the plan period? The reason is that the ministers approved this plan with a specific number in it. They directed the council to take particular action to ensure that that number was delivered. And they approved a policy, how-to, which said if you're not maintaining enough land over the next 5 years to deliver that housing land requirement, further action needs to be taken, in addition to the action programme updates.
Well, okay, well, that addresses, I think that addresses my point. We've got a clear answer. I think you don't have you've got a figure for the 5 year, for the shortfall in the 5 year effective housing land supply, which is shown in paragraph 2.111. You give me reasons for that, and for not using the methodology that you've used in the table at which you arrived at the 3 years effective housing land supply. shown in the housing land supply statement. Are you content with that summary of your position? Yes.
Thank you.
Well, I better pass to Mr. McCorriston for the council. If you want to just set out your response to the appellant's position on this first agenda item on the method for calculating 5-year effective housing land supply.
Yes, sir. Absolutely happy to do that. And I have to say I'm slightly confused by the position. It does seem to be coming up with a methodology and figures which, to the council's reading, are not supported anywhere in development plan policy or Scottish planning policy. But maybe, sir, I can start with an agreement with Mr. MacLeod, which is that this is an equation. It's about comparing the availability of land with the requirement for that land, and this is fundamental to the council's position on all of this, because although that's an equation, it's unfortunate that only one side of the equation can ever be updated with the development plan. So the council has consistently argued that the requirement set out in the plan is out of date and an overestimate of requirement. There's lots of evidence to support that, and no doubt we'll come on to that. But the view of reporters has consistently been you cannot update that requirement out with the development plan process. That to the council is simply wrong, because it doesn't allow for the updated assessment of the availability of land to be compared with an updated assessment of the requirement. And that requirement has been updated on a number of occasions since the LDP was adopted.
Are you referring to the HNDAs in particular there?
Well, I'm referring to those, sir, indeed. But even before that, I'm referring to the failed SDP2, because although that failed in terms of the assessment of essentially transportation impact, what happened there was that the reporter completely reassessed the housing land requirement and set out that the figures in SDP1 were essentially far too high. Now that never saw the light of day because SDP failed, but that was the start of it. We then had Honda 2, which confirmed that the requirement for housing in West Lothian, depending on the which of the growth assumptions were considered, but a figure of around about 700 houses per annum as the housing need. That figure was supported in Honda 3, which has
housing need and demand. Yeah,
housing need and demand. Yeah, sorry, apologies. And those most recently, Honda 3 has received the robust and credible status that is required, and is now incorporated into NPF4, National Planning Framework 4, and indeed, in terms of incorporating the figures in NPF4, the Scottish ministers put significant weight on, in my view, on the fact that West Lothian has been through the Honda process. So the minimum all tenure housing land requirement figures set out in the NPF4 are based on that most up-to-date assessment of the requirement for housing.
Where did you do that in the text of NPF4?
It does so, sir, in the
heading of the policy 16, is there?
No,
the heading of public policy.
So there is an addendum report. Apologies, sir.
Right, okay.
Yeah, there's an addendum report. So it's National Planning Framework 4 Housing Land Requirement Report Addendum.
Well, perhaps we can get onto that when we talk about NPF4. That might be a bit.
Yeah. But so to crystallise the council's case, it's everything which the appellant is seeking to do here is ignoring that requirement, that updated evidence of housing land requirement. I'll just pick up on some of the other points made by Mr. MacLeod. Of course, Mr. MacLeod is quite wrong to say that every reporter has taken his approach in appeals which have been determined in West Lothian. That simply isn't the case. Certainly a significant number of appeals or reporters have followed that case, but it is not the case that every reporter has followed that. And again, we will no doubt come on to discuss that. But the significance of that, sir, is that if you take that into account, those determinations or notices of intention by your colleagues at DPA actually add a significant amount to the land supply. I think the figure we've got is 1,356 units.
So you'd have to set out to me what so it was 1,356. You have to set out to me what that was and over what time scale.
Yeah.
I don't think I've got a table before me of that addition to the housing land supply. Are you talking about since? Sorry.
I was going to ask that as well, sir, because I don't recall seeing that anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we can certainly do that. I'm making the general point at this point in time, but we can give the detail.
Hold on. I mean, is that would the appellant be content if we just get a table afterwards and the appellant can respond to that figure?
Yeah, we can certainly do that.
Well, no, I was asking Mr. MacLeod. Sorry.
Yes, I would quite like to see a table. That would be helpful.
Okay, just give us an idea of the broad outline of what that figure is. Is that every decision since the West Lothian Local Development Plan came? Every appeal decision since the West Lothian Local Development Plan came in, or is that?
No, sir. It is.
Or is it those specific decisions mentioned by the appellant? Or?
Yeah. So it is primarily the latter, but we've taken the starting point of Housing Land Audit 21 because we'll come on to a question about Housing Land Audit 21, and the appellants suggest that gives you the 5-year effective land supply. Well, it doesn't. It's certainly a starting point for that, but these sites are sites where your colleagues, sir, have granted it where they're not included in Housing Land Audit 21, so they're a significant addition to that. All clearly justified on the basis that there's a shortfall in the land supply. So it would be remiss not to include those in any assessment of that shortfall because they have been granted on the basis that that shortfall existed. But we can provide the detail for that, sir, and it might come out in a bit more detail in the issue about the land supply itself or the Housing Land Audit. So I said I was slightly confused by the appellant's position with respect to the 5-year effective land supply, and you questioned this yourself, where in paragraph 2.5 of the appellant's hearing statement, they say that Housing Land Audit 21 demonstrates the 5-year effective housing land supply.
Mm. Have we not dealt with that point? Is there?
Yeah, well, the only point I wanted to add, sir, was that if that is the appellant's case, then clearly policy 7 and how to can't be invoked because they're saying there is an effective 5-year land supply.
But we know that that's not the appellant's case because the appellant has set out that their measurement of the housing 5-year effective housing land supply is in paragraph 2.111, which is effectively, if one considers the full 5-year effective housing land supply of 9,040 homes that the council predicts will be built by 2026, and compares that against the housing land requirement to 2024, there's a substantial shortfall of 2,833 homes. What's wrong with that, if anything?
Well, so it's that bit about bringing that requirement in, isn't it? So it was your point about when you set the question, you specifically said that you had taken the sufficiency of the requirement out of your question and brought it into two parts. So if we're dealing only with the first part about the assessment of the land supply, then I suppose we agree with the appellant that that is the figure that is set out in Housing Land Audit, plus the addition of the appeal sites. So if that's as far as you go with that, then that is fine. But if we look at the requirement, that's when it becomes much more challenging. And as I say, that figure set out in 2.111 of the appellant's case, where they set out the figure of 2,833 as a shortfall. Again, that's a figure that is not supported by any up-to-date evidence of the deficiency in the land supply. And again, I would refer yourself to the most up-to-date assessment of the housing land requirement in West Lothian, which is set out in the NPF4 housing land requirement report addendum. Now, what that says...
But just a moment before you go on, isn't it, I mean, it's a feature of a long-standing feature of reporters' decisions that that top part of the equation, the 5-year requirement, is a product of policy, not actually of the of any measurement of demand, or not directly of any measurement of demand. Obviously, there is a policy that's produced having considered demand, but it might not be the demand in a particular location that sets the policy. And obviously, CES plan is has been treated as a single housing market, and as I understand it, the housing land requirement and housing supply target were set for West Lothian in the current CES plan, not directly relating to West Lothian's need or demand for housing, but relating to the wider need and demand for housing in the CES plan area. Is that not correct?
No, that's not my understanding, sir. So there was an overall assessment of housing need and demand carried out, but all those figures were related back, subdivided back to individual local authorities. So there is a specific requirement for each local authority.
Of course that's the case. And that's a requirement of SPP to set a housing supply target and consequently a housing land requirement for each authority. But if you keep the whole of the CES plan area as a wider housing market area, the figure for West Lothian is not directly related to demand from West Lothian, is it?
It is. Yeah, there is no transfer of demand across the wider housing market area. It is a demand figure for West Lothian. I think, Mr. McCune,
even if taking that to be the case, I mean, you could still set a policy that is more expansive for a particular local authority, or you could set a policy that's very closely restricted, takes a fairly narrow view of what is required, and policy can vary quite a lot, even on the basis of a housing need and demand assessment. What I'm saying is housing need and demand assessment is not necessarily directly translated into that top line of the equation, the 5-year requirement. Is it?
Well, I think it is, sir.
Oh, okay.
So you're correct that you could take a different approach. The facts are that that different approach hasn't been taken, and the requirements set out in SDP and each of the Hondas, and now in NPF4 are specific requirements for each of the local authorities, that there is no transfer of demand across local authority boundaries.
Okay, so then going back to the top line in this case, the housing land requirement set for West Lothian, that then was a direct reflection of demand in West Lothian, and there's a requirement in the policy that the 5-year housing land requirement should be met at all times. Is that not a stronger case for ensuring that the housing land requirement is met? 5-year housing land.
Yeah. So you're right, sir. That is the test that has to be done. The position comes back to how can you calculate a 5-year land requirement where there is no 5 years left in the plan itself, and it's not acceptable in the council's position to start looking at 5-year supplies or remaining parts of the requirement itself. What you have to do, sir, in the council's opinion, is look at that stage. You have to look at the most up-to-date assessment of housing requirements, and that's the bit that hasn't been done thus far. So we continue to plan for housing requirement, which all the evidence is far too high and out of date.
But surely, I mean, none of my fellow reporters have accepted that you look at the HNDA so far in any of the decisions, as far as I've seen, and draw a 5-year housing land supply from that. Is that? I mean, can I do that?
No, you can't draw a 5-year housing land requirement from that, because the 5-year housing land requirement is not a feature of NPF4. It takes a completely different approach to establishing the requirement for housing. So in my humble view, sir, the requirement for 5-year supply, an effective 5-year supply at all times, falls with SPP and falls with SDP1. And doesn't
that leave me with a problem, because I have to determine this appeal according to the development plan, unless there are considerations indicate otherwise. There are 2 policies in the development plan that refer to the 5-year effective housing land supply. You're saying, well, I think you're saying I should refer to NPF4. Do I not have to first determine what the development plan says?
Well, you have to do as you have said there, sir. You have to consider the development plan unless material circumstances dictate otherwise. And it's certainly the council's view that the settled position of the Scottish ministers, as set out in NPF4, is an issue of very significant materiality in terms of how you assess the requirements for land.
But what do I do with those 2 policies in particular? What do I do with CESP Plan 7 and West Lothian Local Development Plan HOU2?
Well, those policies in the council's view are not invoked.
Not invoked?
Not invoked, because there is no deficiency in the effective land supply. So therefore, well, you can't establish a deficiency in the 5-year land supply. So therefore, those policies are not invoked.
Okay. Okay, just a moment. Let me check my notes, and I'll see if there's anything else to ask. Is it sorry? Is that? Do you have anything further on this point that you wanted to respond to?
Well, sir, just one further thing, and again, Mr. MacLeod referred to the direction of the minister in 2018, and set out the minister's perceived difficulty with the council's position, and then went on to say that the council does not appear to have done very much about that in the interim, and that's set out in paragraph 2.56 of the appellant's hearing statement. So again, just a bit of a reminder about the background to that. So Mr. MacLeod is correct that the reporters found a deficiency in the land supply at the time of the LDP. But interestingly, the reporters sought not to address that. And in fact, by one measure, your colleagues made the problem slightly worse by actually removing sites from the plan. So actually, at the end of the process, there was slightly less land.
I don't want to get deep into the process, but as I recall, there was an attempt during the North Lanarkshire local plan by the reporters to add in sites, and it was regarded as that it kind of bypassed some of the processes and made the process very difficult. So that was, I think that is that not the reason that lies behind them not adding in sites rather than saying simply that sites need to be added through a policy?
With respect, sir, and like you, I don't want to go too far into it, but I don't think that is the case, because your colleagues did in fact add sites to the plan, so they clearly weren't overly concerned about adding sites out with that policy context. So they added sites, but added fewer sites than they took away in terms of absolute numbers. So that clearly didn't seem to be an issue for them, and it was clear, I think, to me certainly, that the reporters understood that there were going to be things that happened that addressed that problem and didn't need to be dealt with through the plan itself. And some of these things are, in paragraph 2.56, the appellant set out that they're not clear what the council has done to deal with it, and that the position of the ministers at the time was somewhat unique in Scotland. Well, of course, what the council has been doing in the interim is working very hard to remove constraints to development. As an example, the council has borrowed £62 million to forward fund significant education investment in Winchborough, 2 secondary schools, to almost singularly deal with the secondary school capacity issue. Now, the impact of that is that there is now no constraint to development of housing, no significant constraint to development of housing in Winchborough, and a significant number of other settlements in West Lothian. So I would simply say to yourself that it is not the case that the council has done nothing. It's unique in Scotland that the council has invested so much to remove infrastructure constraints, and that in doing so, there is absolutely no reason why all of the houses in Winchborough couldn't be built in the next year, all of the remaining houses, which would get rid of any perceived deficit in the land supply from the appellants. Of course, the reason why those houses are not all built in the next year is there is no demand for those houses. Otherwise, presumably, the market would deal with it, because there is no constraint on the delivery of those houses now. And it's not just in Winchborough, it's a significant number of sites elsewhere, the Calderwood CDA, where there is...
I think we're slightly drifting off the subject of the calculation.
It was to make that point, so that the council has invested heavily to address the deficiency identified by the appellants in paragraph 2.55 and 2.56, and that in doing so, there is no constraint, no significant constraint to the bringing forward of land to meet any perceived deficiency. But so that covers the points which I wanted to make in response to Mr. MacLeod's positions.
Okay. Right. Okay, so Mr. MacLeod, do you want to respond to the council's case and any points raised there?
Yes, just a couple of points. I don't want to get into Winchborough in detail, but there is plenty of evidence out there that shows that ultimately West Lothian only got involved in funding that school due to Scottish Government intervention. Now, we'll no doubt come on to discuss the Council's approach to education infrastructure support in due course once we get into the education topic, but I did want to make that point generally. One point on the Council's approach to the LDP requirement, and it might be useful just to get Mr. McCorrison's clarification on this point. The LDP itself, so this is paragraph 64 of the LDP, paragraph 63 as well. So 63 says local authorities are to provide generous housing land supply to meet housing need across all tenures and to maintain at all times 5-year effective supply of housing land. To achieve this, LDPs are required to allocate suitable land on a range of sites which are effective or expected to become effective to meet the housing land requirement, ensuring a minimum of 5 years effective land supply at all times. Just pausing there.
That's a quotation from SPP, isn't it, more or less?
More or less, sir, yes, it is. Yeah, so it's built into paragraph 64 of the LDP. Mm-hmm. And the reason I emphasise the fact that it's actually set out in the LDP is that, as Mr. McCorson's quite rightly said, Scottish planning policy will disappear when National Planning Framework 4 comes into force, as will the Strategic Development Plan. But this will remain development plan policy, and that's an important point. Mm-hmm. So the question really is, when the LDP talks about maintaining a 5-year effective land supply at all times to meet housing land requirement, does Mr McCorson accept that it can only mean the housing land requirement set out in that local development plan?
Just a minute, let me just understand that.
Yes.
So we're on paragraph 64.
64, yeah.
LDPs are required to allocate suitable land. Yeah. So you're saying that the ensuring there refers to it's not just something that planning authorities are required separately to do.
Yeah.
So they're required both to allocate sufficient sites to meet the housing land requirement and to ensure a minimum of a 5-year effective housing land supply at all time. You're saying the purpose of allocating land on a range of sites which are effective is to ensure a minimum of a 5-year effective housing land supply at all times.
Yes, but also that the purpose of ensuring a minimum of 5 years effective land supply at all times, the purpose of that is to ensure that the housing land requirement in the local development plan is delivered.
How do you get that out of that sentence?
Well, let me put it rhetorically. What is the purpose of maintaining minimum 5-year effective land supply? It is linked to the policy requirements of the LDP. Policy requirements of the LDP are to ensure that the housing land requirement is met.
Well, Mr. McCorson, do you have a response? It's in the plan, isn't it?
Indeed, sir. Happy to respond, and it would be, I suppose, no surprise that I don't agree with Mr. McLeod's interpretation there. And of course, that's not an interpretation that has been taken by your colleagues elsewhere. There's an inevitability in a 2-tier plan system that one part of the plan is going to be inconsistent with the other part of the plan. So when NPF4 becomes part of the development plan, there's an inevitability that some of that will
sir,
be...
I'm sorry to interrupt, and I appreciate this is not a public inquiry, but we'll come on to NPF4 and the fact that Mr. McCorson says that's a material consideration and so on.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to understand, specifically in relation to this point about interpretation of this part of the development plan, whether the council accepts that when it talks about maintaining a 5-year effective housing land supply at all times to meet the housing land requirement, it's the land requirement in the plan. Mr. McCorson's point is that other material considerations may be relevant to you, but as far as this plan is concerned, it surely must be the housing land requirement set out in this plan.
Sort of, Mr. McLeod had allowed me to finish, I would have come on to that point. I was talking about the status of a 2-tier development plan, whether that be the SDP or whether it be the LDP, and there will be, the SDP or NPF4, and there will clearly be an inconsistency, it is a matter of fact that when those inconsistencies arise, it is the most up-to-date component of the development plan which takes precedence. So therefore, the test will not be what is set out in the LDP. The test will be what is set out in the most up-to-date component of the development plan, which will very shortly, we assume, be NPF4. But of course, sir, you don't have to take my word for that. You can look at what your colleagues have said elsewhere, and I'll refer you to paragraph 2.38 of the council's hearing statement, where we talk about Reporter Warren in the South East Wedge decision, where he addresses this very point and says that for all the reasons that I've just set out, that the LDP requirement in these circumstances must fall. You have to look at the most up-to-date evidence to support that. So therefore,
Okay. Just let me read that. And that says that figures must be regarded as out of date. Yeah, but it doesn't say that it isn't the purpose of the 5-year effective housing land supply to achieve the housing land requirement.
Yeah, so it comes back to the same process in the council's use of that if it's out of date, how can you then properly assess it? So you have to go and look at what the most up-to-date evidence is. And you said earlier on, sir, that you didn't believe that this approach had been supported in any of the cases in West Lothian. Again, that's not...
I meant specifically looking at external documents like evidence on demand, like the Hondas. So if it's a case that you can point me to, that'd be useful. Yeah.
Yeah. So the case, sir, is the appeal case at Drumshoreland.
At which one?
At Drumshoreland.
Drumshoreland, right.
Yeah.
But that's been quashed.
I can get you that. It has been quashed. It's been quashed for, as the council understands it, very particular issues in relation to double counting of supply. But the matter itself, addressed by the reporter there, was about prematurity. Given where we are with NPF4, it was about the inability to calculate an effective 5-year land supply, etc., etc. I say my understanding is that's not the basis upon which the appeal was challenged. I have to say we had some difficulty finding what the basis of that challenge was, because nobody would tell us, but we eventually got there and we understand it's not part of that. So there is precedent in West Lothian in that case, sir.
But the decision is gone. I mean, there has no state saying.
Well, the matter is for reconsideration. Certainly, the decision is quashed, but not on those parts which relate to prematurity of the 5-year land supply. I accept, if a decision is quashed, it's quashed. But the challenge was not on those parts of it, sir.
Okay.
I may have missed it altogether, and I'm sorry, I'm sure it's me, but I thought Mr. McCorriston was going to address the point that I had raised, which is in paragraph 64, the LDP, when it talks about maintaining a 5-year land supply to meet housing land requirement. Is it the housing land requirement in the LDP?
Just a moment, Mr. McLeod.
Yes.
Required to allocate suitable land on a range of sites which are effective or expected to become effective to meet the housing land requirement, ensuring a minimum of 5-year effective land supply at all times.
Yes.
It seems to me that sentence can mean two things. One is that the council are required to allocate sufficient land to meet to meet the housing land requirement, and they're required to have a minimum 5-year effective housing land supply, and using the what it's called, the verbal adjective there, adjective, I think, yeah, is simply sloppy grammar, or it means that purpose of allocating the sites to meet the housing land requirement is also to ensure that there's a minimum of a 5-year effective housing land supply at all times. But I don't take from that sentence that ensuring that the purpose of, just logically looking at it, the purpose of setting a 5-year effective housing land supply is to meet the housing land requirement.
Well, let me put it to you a slightly different way then. And if you look at policy how to, sir, the council is required to maintain a minimum of a 5-year effective housing land supply at all times throughout the lifetime of the plan. For what purpose? The purpose of maintaining the 5-year effective housing land supply is to ensure that the housing land requirement will be delivered.
Where does it say that in the plan?
Well, that's surely the logical interpretation of policy how to policy 60, paragraph 64.
Is it? I mean, are they not just two separate things? Maintaining a 5-year effective housing land supply and allocating sufficient land to meet the housing land requirement in the plan. They're, ultimately, isn't the 5-year effective housing land supply a forward-looking thing? That's, it goes forward from, well, the base. We usually take the base of the last housing land audit and look forward.
But a forward-looking thing to achieve what? When we spoke at the beginning and we talked about the difference between the residual. That's
an interesting question. You tell me.
Yeah, yeah, indeed. So when we talked about the difference between residual and the average, I said that at the very beginning of the plan, it's very straightforward because the residual and the average approach were the same. You essentially took the housing land requirement, divided it by 12, if that was the duration of the plan, and you then multiply that by 5 to see whether your effective supply married up with 5/12 of the requirement. Now, inherent in all of that is the fact that you are trying to achieve a housing land requirement by the end of the plan. That is the purpose of maintaining an effective 5-year land supply.
Yeah. Well, the courts have always said that the question of the method by which the 5-year effective housing land supply is determined is a matter for not discretion. I think one of the earlier decisions said discretion. I think it's a matter of judgment for reporters. And if the courts had meant that the 5-year, the meaning of the policy is that the housing land requirement must be met, surely they wouldn't have left that to the judgment of reporters. They would have said it's for, the 5-year effective housing land supply is to be determined in order to meet the housing land requirement of the plan. Although they would have said what the method was effectively, and it would have been the residual method.
Well, not necessarily, sir. One way of looking at it, just to use my example, is have a think about a scenario at the beginning of the plan period and then one towards the end of the plan period, like we're in now. At the beginning of the plan period, it might be reasonable for a reporter to say, well, I'm not going to apply the residual method because actually the evidence shows me that although there's been a deficiency in year 1 of the plan, that deficiency is going to be made up in year 2 or year 3. And actually, I don't really need to apply a residual method at the moment because I have confidence based on the evidence from the council looking at its housing land audit that there are going to be enough completions on a rolling basis over the next few years that the average method can be applied, that the land supply will catch up and so on. So that's the beginning of the plan period. Think now about the end of the plan period where we know that the LDP says there's a housing land requirement to be delivered by the end of 2024. That at that point in time, we say it's incumbent on decision makers to apply the residual method, because if you don't apply the residual method, you will never achieve the housing land requirement.
But that's simply a restatement of your evidence, isn't it? That doesn't persuade me that the purpose of HOU2 or SES Plan 7 or the purpose of setting a 5-year effective housing land supply is to meet the housing land requirement. If you've got a policy on that, could you direct me to it?
Want to go to image? That's one thing.
Yeah. So Mr. Salter can tell you about this. I think he's referring to the SES Plan technical report,
right?
Which is MH 2.03.
Right. So we're going back to 2014. Is that right?
We're going back to one of the founding documents of CESPLAN. So,
Okay.
and if you're looking at that document at paragraph 7.3,
Maintaining the supply of effective land for at least 5 years total times in accord with approved policies 6 and 7 should ensure that there is a continuing generous supply of land for house building. Okay. What do you want to tell me about that?
member authorities will base their calculation for the 5-year effective housing land supply on the period 2009 to 24, taking into considering housing completions. So you have to look over so that can only be the period 2009 to 24, and it refers back to table 3.1, sir, which were...
Before you go on, let me take it in. So that's essentially, I mean, it's essentially a kind of assumption that the residual method is going to be used, yeah?
And that was taken forward through the LDP examination report. And we have the figures on the LDP examination report where Reporter Warren concluded that there was likely to be a shortfall. I can call up that table if that is helpful, sir. Oh, sorry, refer you to that table is probably the right way of saying it. So that's the MH 2.07, which is the examination report correction.
Just let me take a note of this one. This was MH
2.03, paragraph 7.3.
7.3, okay. And MH 2.07. Right. And this is the table produced for housing, yeah? Yeah.
Quite rightly, Reporter Warren said at the time, there is going to be a shortfall. That's the calculations that were undertaken during the examination. As you can see there is a shortfall of 4,748 homes against the housing land requirement and a shortfall of 2,947 homes against the housing supply target. He then baked into, the purpose of policy in the examination report was, should that position continue? Because Reporter Warren didn't know whether things were going to improve in the effective housing land supply in the next audit or the next audit, or because that's the purpose, you're meant to monitor. And how to, that was a release policy to enable the figure to be met. It was all about meeting the figure. That's in the examination report.
Right.
I think we've referred to that quite a few times, so I can find those for you later.
Just on the examination report, there are a couple of paragraphs that are possibly relevant to you, and those are in 89 and 90. Which are in the it's page 79 of the section on housing land supply.
If you read the PDF, so the PDF is MH 2.06, sir. And the PDF page, if that is more helpful, is page 79, as I said, of the...
Yeah, page 79.
Okay. That's PDF page... PDF page 89. So 89 is the PDF.
Page 89 and paragraph?
Paragraphs 89 and 90. The whole of that section will be relevant to you, I suspect, in terms of understanding what policy how to means. But you'll see in 89, the reporter talks about his conclusion that the number of homes which will be built in West Lothian up to 2024 is likely to fall significantly short of the plan's housing supply target, which will raise difficulties the council in demonstrating it's maintaining at least a 5-year supply of effective housing land at all times, as required by SPP. So again, 5-year land supply linked into, in that case, he's referring to the target, but I don't think there's any disagreement with the council that the requirement is the correct figure. Position in their hearing statement. He says, consequently, the frequency of when policy how to would become engaged in decision making and the weight attributed to its provisions are likely to be greater than if, for example, there was clear evidence of a surplus of effective housing land supply, and the value of policy how to is it offers the potential to provide clarity on what actions will be needed in order to maintain a 5-year effective supply, as well as confirming the steps to be taken should the effective supply become deficient. Now, he's talking there about the policy as drafted, not the policy that finally found its way in the plan. You'll see the modifications that he made. But it's my submission that it's clear that the effective supply, 5-year effective supply requirement is linked into the figures in the LDP. That is the reason they are there.
I've no doubt it's linked. And clearly that paragraph shows it's linked, and it suggests a correlation between the use of policy HOU2 and the amount of housing land allocated. But it doesn't. But as a matter of policy interpretation, I don't think there's anything there that says that the purpose of setting a 5-year effective housing land supply is in order to ensure that the housing land requirement is met. Plainly, it's saying that there will be difficulties in demonstrating that the 5-year effective housing land supply if the housing land requirement is not met. But it's not saying that the purpose of the policy, or the purpose of setting a 5-year effective housing land supply, is that is in order to meet the housing land requirement, is it?
I'm just looking to see if there's anything else in the LDP report that might assist you with that. Yeah. Paragraphs 94 and 95 on the following page. Look at what the reporter was considering in terms of modification. It says on balance, he considers a modification to the first sentence of how to be justified. An appropriate amendment would be to state the council is required to maintain a minimum 5-year effective housing land supply at all times. 95, the council's, I think, keen that seem to refer to CES Plan Policy 7. No, there's no specific linkage in those paragraphs. Again, I suppose to come back to the legal text, which is when you're interpreting policies, what court tells you, the Supreme Court tells you, is that policies are written in broad terms. You need to understand what they mean, taking their or understanding their meaning objectively and in context. Now, what we have here is an LDP examination report where the reporters found there was highly likely to be a deficiency in meeting the housing land requirement. You have them imposing changes, recommending changes to policy how to ensure the maintenance of the 5-year land supply. And the reason for maintaining the 5-year land supply, in my submission at least, is that it was to meet the housing land requirement. Very difficult to see what other purpose having a 5-year land supply would have, or how one would measure the adequacy of that 5-year land supply. And maybe that's the fundamental point. when understanding the adequacy of the 5-year land supply, one must surely measure it against the housing land requirement in the plan that sets the requirement.
Okay. Just have a couple more minor questions, I think, or just one more minor question. Yeah, there was you'd referred to the table in the reporters in the West Lothian local development plan examination arrived at, and you produced in the housing land supply statement, your housing land supply statement. There was a kind of a redraft of that table, updated, and it's at it's the table after 319. And I'm just looking at that line D in that table, which says the effective supply 2020 to 2024, and you've measured the shortfall against the effective supply. So effectively, you've taken from housing land audit the first 3 years of that audit, yeah, and you've used that figure there in that table in 319, and you've arrived at a shortfall of 7,375 against the housing land requirement, and a shortfall of 5,574 against the housing supply target. But that's no longer your position, as I understand it. The position is that it's the 5-year effective housing land supply as shown in the audit, rather than the first 3 years of programme that I should take into account.
Yes, that table is an update of the position to illustrate that if we were to undergo the examination again, the reason why those figures differ slightly is just to clarify, is there's a windfall assumption inherently built in, sir, firstly. So that's row G. So the council was expected to release further housing sites. And then there's also row H, demolitions, which were built in. Yeah. You take those figures out, if you take out the demolitions and the windfall, you get to the same shortfall position of 6,928. But as we said, if you compare the remaining housing land requirement over that to 2024 against the 5-year effective supply, which is 9,040 homes, you get to the 2,833 figure, I believe. Yeah.
Right. So your 2,000, your figure in paragraph 2111, that's essentially a figure derived from that table, but replacing the 4,945 with 9,040.
Yes.
Great. Okay, that's perfect.
Can I just come back to one? I was just having a quick look through the LDP examination report, following on from your previous question to me, sir.
Sure.
A couple of further paragraphs that you might find helpful are paragraphs 109 to 112.
109 to 112. Okay. I'll have a read of that. Is there anything you want to draw my attention to just now, or should I look at that later?
Well, I'll just read it very briefly. In paragraph 109, given my earlier conclusions that the number of homes that will be built in West Lothian up to 2024 is likely to fall significantly short of the plan's housing supply target, the plan's response to this is key. Through this examination, as part of the response, additional sites have been recommended. Modifications to policy how to have been recommended to provide a clear policy approach to land release where circumstances required such an approach. And then 111 picks up on Mr. McCorrison's point about using other numbers. The reporter says, I'm mindful of the extensive arguments made by the council that the proposed SDP contains substantially lower housing land requirement than the adopted SDP, I must reiterate my conclusion that no weight can be placed on SDP2, which is currently subject to examination, and the proposed LDP must comply with the adopted SDP, etc. So, again, a clear linkage, I think, between the numbers in the LDP and the need to maintain a 5-year land supply.
Okay, well, take that on board. Okay, Mr. McCorson, I will come back to you in a moment, and then we can finish off this part of the agenda. There was one other question, so it's probably a fairly minor point. But actually maybe a couple of things. Yeah. In paragraph 219 of the appeal statement, you refer to the purpose and objective of the LDP housing allocations being to meet the housing land requirement for the planned period, i.e. to deliver 19,811 homes. Surely the purpose of the housing land requirement is to deliver 18,010 homes, in other words, the housing supply target.
All right, put yourself on mute there. Well, no, the purpose of the allocation is to meet the housing land requirement. I think that's the council's position as well.
So you're saying that the plan requires 19,811 homes to be built?
Yes, my understanding is that's the council's position as well.
Is that the council's position?
Well, sir, it depends on how you interpret this whole argument. In my view, sir, the purpose of a plan-led system is to provide sufficiency of housing for the needs and demands of the local population, and that's informed by a whole number of processes, which ultimately come back to the equation that we spoke about at the start of it. It's comparing the supply with the demand for housing. And we spent quite a lot of time looking at the basis of how these figures are calculated. But irrespective of that, they have a margin of flexibility in them. Now so the housing land requirement is actually more than the demand. By any calculation, it's more than the demand for housing. So therefore, if you were to meet that figure, you would be simply building houses that there was no demand for. The difference in there is to give a flexibility margin on the assumption that sites come out the supply, sites come into the supply. So logic would tell me, sir, that you have to meet the land supply target, which is the most up-to-date assessment of need and demand for housing in a local area.
So which target is that? The housing supply target or the housing land requirement?
The housing supply target.
No, it's housing supply target. Right.
So the supply of housing, essentially, rather than, if we try and break down the terminology, what is the supply of housing which is required to meet demand in West Lothian, as opposed to how much housing land requirement do you have to allocate to give a bit of flexibility in terms of meeting that demand for housing. So the plan has to allocate the housing land supply requirement, but the demand for housing is the lower level because there's a flexibility margin in there. So a long answer to come back to the basic question is, what is it we're trying to meet here? And in my view, it is the calculated demand for housing. That's what the plan-led system should be about. It should be about making sure that the need for the housing needs of the local population are facilitated by the plan.
Right. So it's the housing supply target that the plan requires to meet.
Yes.
Okay. There was one other. Sorry, just before you come back on it, Mr. McLeod. Well, I'll give the council a final say on this topic. Then I'll give you a final say. But I did have one other question that I wanted to ask before we go on, and that's the council statement at paragraph 227 compares the housing land requirement with the total amount of unconstrained housing land shown in the 2021 audit, rather than with the 5-year supply shown in the audit. Why isn't that the correct approach to take in determining whether the housing land requirement is met?
Sorry, can I just check, sir, who was that question for? Is that for the council?
No, that was a question for you, for the appellant.
Oh, my apologies. Would you mind just repeating that? So 227, although the housing land requirement.
The housing land requirement remains within the West Lothian Local Development Plan for the same reasons. It's not relevant if completions are less than the housing land requirement. There is sufficient unconstrained housing land to meet the housing land requirement, as evidenced in Housing Land Audit 2021. So they're comparing the total amount of unconstrained land in West Lothian with the housing land requirement.
I understand. So it's a question of what does one mean by unconstrained? So let's take a scenario. Mr. McCorson mentioned Winchborough earlier. I don't want to get into the detail of it, but in basic terms, it's a very big site and it was constrained by education infrastructure. That constraint, I think, has been lifted now, so it is possible to build. Now, the reality is that there are some houses in Winchborough or a general settlement like that will not come forward for many, many years to come, simply because of programming, the need to deliver road infrastructure, etc., etc. And I come back to the fundamental point of the LDP, which is it sets numbers that were to be achieved by 2024. So when one talks about an unconstrained site, one might be talking about houses that, although there's no obvious infrastructure constraint, there's no prospect of them being built in the next 5-year period, maybe even in the next 10-year period. That will depend on the specifics of the site in question. But policy how-to directs you to, well, again, come back to what is the meaning of the policy, what's the rationale for the policy. Policy how-to talks about one of the criteria being that development will happen within the next 5 years. That's an important figure for the purposes of this LDP. It's not simply, it will happen at some point in the future. The LDP wants things to happen within the next 5-year period, presumably so that the LDP keeps pace with the housing land requirement and delivers what it was supposed to.
Okay. But if you're dealing with the housing land requirement set by SES plan, and you're producing a local development plan, you do two things with it, don't you? You compare the amount of housing land with the housing land requirement, or the amount of allocations with the housing land requirement, and you determine whether there's a 5-year effective housing land supply. Is that not correct?
Sorry, are you asking, sir, what one would do at the point of producing the LDP?
I'm asking what the relevant comparator is for the housing land requirement.
I'm maybe not following.
Your position is that there's a 5-year that the purpose of the housing land requirement is to set the 5-year effective housing land requirement. The purpose of the 5-year effective housing land requirement is to ensure that the housing, the purpose of the 5-year requirement is to ensure that the of setting a 5-year effective housing land supply is to ensure that the housing land requirement set in the plan is met.
Yes.
But are they just not simply two separate things? There's a housing land requirement, which you compare with the amount of allocated land if you're producing a development plan, and there's a 5-year effective housing land supply which must be maintained at all times. And these two things are connected, but the one is not the purpose of the other. Is it not appropriate? The appropriate comparator. I mean, obviously we're not dealing with allocations here, but is the council not correct in saying that the amount of unconstrained land is the relevant comparator to the housing land requirement?
No.
No.
And it might be at the very beginning of the plan when it's talking about the allocations that should be made in the plan, because it might say, well, if you look to the future, LDP reporter, if you look to the future, you can see that we've got masses of unconstrained land and that everything is going to be fine. The issue is that as time goes on and as we get closer to the end point of the plan, when the plan's requirement must be delivered, you can't simply rely on unconstrained land way into the future. What you're supposed to be doing is ensuring that there is enough active, effective land in the system that's likely to deliver houses in line with the requirements set out in the plan.
So just on the final point, the plan, the amount being required to be delivered, plans can change, can't they? You wouldn't necessarily roll the deficit from the previous plan. You don't say I have to complete this year. It's not like a Russian 5-year plan. It's you don't have to complete one plan and before you start the next or demonstrate that you completed it. You can change the plan and decide that you're going to do something else. So you wouldn't necessarily roll the shortfall forward.
You might not, but that is an issue for the next local development plan, if that's what you're alluding to, sir. That's a decision that the council will have to take in the context of National Planning Framework 4, following a thorough examination of the housing need and demand for its area. And to pick up on a point that you were touching on earlier on, matters such as the regional spatial strategy for the CESS plan area. And you asked Mr. McCorriston about whether the West Lothian local development plan effectively covered its own need and demand only. And I think Mr. McCorriston said yes. Our understanding is that's not correct, and that there was an element of Edinburgh's need that was exported to West Lothian. Now I see Mr. McCorriston shaking his head, and I don't want you to go away from this hearing today thinking that is a settled position between the parties. And I would suggest that perhaps the best way to deal with it is you invite us to make submissions on that matter, because I think it is a little more complicated than was suggested earlier on.
All right, but if you're both happy with doing that.
Yes, I'm happy to do that. I mean, the council's clear position is that the Edinburgh and Lothian structure plan, the predated SDP, had an element of mobile demand, but that was removed in SDP 1. Happy to make.
Sorry, I missed that. Could you say that again?
Yeah, sorry, I was saying that the council's clear position is that the Edinburgh and Lothian's, sorry, I think it was just called the Lothian Structure Plan 1994, scratching my depths of my memory here, that had an element of mobile demand across the city region. So the structure plan assumed movement across boundaries. SDP 1 and the terminology that was used at the time was consuming their own smoke. So each local authority has to meet their demand in totality.
Okay, so I think what we'll do is we'll just round off this section if both parties think starting with the council has anything further to say on this particular agenda point, and then we'll take a break. Okay. So starting with Mr. McCorriston.
Yeah, thank you, sir, and I will keep it brief. I want to cover 2 points: housing delivery and shortfalls, because those were matters that arose. So we had there a detailed discussion about paragraph 2.27 of the council's hearing statement and the level of unconstrained supply out there. A fundamental, sir, and this has been picked up by your colleagues elsewhere, that the council cannot force delivery, cannot force the construction of houses, other than to the extent where it is a house provider itself. But the council cannot force house builders to build houses. All it can do is ensure that there is sufficient land available to do that. And it's clear from the council's position that there is a significant amount of unconstrained supply. I think the question for you, sir, is why is that unconstrained supply not coming forward to meet the significant deficit which is alleged by the appellants?
Mm.
And so, I've said already, from the council's perspective, that is because that deficiency does not exist, and all the evidence points to that. So you also talked about shortfalls and whether it was appropriate to roll shortfalls forward from year to year or plan to plan. The council could take a view, has taken a view on whether you should roll the shortfall forward, but the reality is that there is no shortfall. So in the council's submission, that's something of a mute argument in terms of whether you should do that.
No shortfall that can be calculated.
The housing need and demand assessment does the calculation of demand and identifies that there is no significant deficiency in the delivery of housing, either currently or as a result of underperformance in the past.
Okay.
And that, yeah, happy to rest on that, sir.
Okay. Thanks. Thank you, Mr. McCorriston. Mr. Cloud?
I'm not sure there's a great deal more that I can say at this stage that's going to assist you. So I'm quite happy to rest on where we're at the moment.
Right. Okay. We'll take a break until 5 to 12. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. everyone. We don't have Tony Irving back. Should we wait? Here he is.
No, yes, sir.
Good. Okay. So we'll move on to, well, the next items on the agenda. I wonder if we've already covered most of what is to be said under item 2. What's everyone think? Yeah.
We were thinking that, sir.
Item
Yes.
2 is covered. Okay. I think probably item 3 is largely covered, but I did have some questions I wanted to ask about that, particularly of the appellant. Has anyone? Right. Well, I'll maybe ask my question, and then if anyone wants to comment on item 3, we can do that. So it's slightly changed by my understanding of the appellant's position, but my understanding is that the key thing that's important is meeting the housing land requirement in the appellant's case, and that's to be done by 2024. Now, obviously, this site produces, well, in the appellant's account, this site would produce 40 houses probably by 2024. There's another, that's a 250 house development, so there'd be 210 that would be beyond that. Now, the appellant's account is that it's actually the 5-year, so it's in terms of the housing land audit, we're required to take into account the 9,040 houses that are in the 5-year supply, and compare that with the overall housing land requirement by 2024. And therefore, the appellant's account is that 150 houses would contribute further to that requirement. Is that a fair assessment of your case?
Yeah, I think so. The point you said that the requirements to be met by 2024, and we agree with that. What we say is that if it can be met by 2024, it should be met as soon as possible after that date. And we say that you should take into account the contribution that is made within the next 5 years by this development, and particularly in light of policy how to criterion D. That's one of the criteria that we must satisfy in order to be an acceptable development under how to, which is that we're expected to deliver new housing within 5 years. And we say it's relevant for you to consider how much housing within the next 5 years.
But I shouldn't interpret that criterion in the context of what your account, that the key thing is to meet the housing land requirement, which must be met by which ends by 2024.
Well, the housing land requirement, it ends when it's replaced by a new local housing land requirement in the next LDP.
Is it?
Yes.
It ends in 20. Well, that's true if that comes in before 2024. But if it comes after 2024, then there's simply no housing land requirement, is there?
I appreciate you. I'm not asking you questions, sir, but rhetorically, does that mean that if the council does nothing between now and 2024, that there's simply no requirement to build any houses going forward? I mean, that cannot be correct. We say that the logical interpretation of the LDP is that it set a requirement which was to be delivered by 2024. The Scottish ministers intervened in 2018 to try and ensure that that requirement would be met by 2024. If it isn't met by 2024, that does not absolve the planning system of delivering the numbers. The numbers must be delivered as soon as possible after 2024.
Ah, right. I see. I hadn't understood that was your position. Right. Okay. So you're simply saying that the 2024 target should be rolled forward until it's met.
Well, the 2024
or replaced.
Or replaced, and that's the important point, sir. I think Mr. McCorriston would probably say this almost with some hesitation, would probably agree with me on that point, that the requirement in the LDP remains until such time as is replaced by the next requirement set out in a local development plan approved by the council.
Okay. So in that context, it's not figure of 40 that's important, 40 by 2024 that's important. It's the figure of 150, which is the 5-year effective housing land supply. Sorry, it's which is the number which we reduced within 5 years. Yeah. Okay. Right, I understand that. Mr. McCorson?
Thank you, sir. I'm grateful for Mr. MacLeod setting out what I might agree with and what I might not agree with. Just for the avoidance of doubt, I don't agree with that position. So where we can agree,
you don't agree that the 2024 target would be rolled forward once 1st March 2024 is passed?
I don't.
So what would the housing target be then? What would be the requirement?
So where I can agree with Mr. MacLeod is that that target should be there until it is replaced. Mr. MacLeod went on to say he assumed I would agree that that was replaced by the local development plan, a new local development plan. That's not the council's position. So I agree that it needs to be replaced. That replacement will take place via NPF4.
Okay, well, we'll come on to that point.
Yeah, so and I say happy to discuss that at the time. So, okay. But in terms of that demand figure set out and the deficiency that we've talked about, I mean, the irony, sir, of this is that if you were to accept that position, that the shortfall, the biggest shortfall identified by the appellants is pretty close to the 10-year figure set out in NPF4, and we will want to explore that in some detail. So it's clear that logically to the council, you can't simply roll that forward. I'm not sure if Mr. MacLeod's position is that should be rolled forward on top of the Mather figure in NPF4, or it is somehow subsumed within that. But there is clearly a process going on which will replace that requirement, and that is the council's position is that is the material matter which you have to consider in terms of the roll forward or the deficiency or the shortfalls are.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Right. Okay. Mr. MacLeod, a response to that.
I got my prediction wrong about Mr. McCorson's level of agreement. Well, I mean, as Mr. McCorson and you have said, we'll come to discuss NPF4 in due course, but it may be helpful if I just set out our position briefly at this stage. The development plan is made up of two parts. At the moment, it's CES plan and the LDP. In probably a few weeks' time, the development plan will be made up of a different two parts, namely the LDP and NPF4. NPF4 cannot change the housing land requirement in the LDP. The LDP requirement remains the same and its policies remain the same. You, sir, will have to have to consider policies in the LDP. You will then have to consider the policies in NPF4, or the other way around if you prefer. And you'll have to reach a view on whether certain policies support and certain don't. But our position, as will probably be clear from the hearing statement, is housing policies in NPF4 direct what is to happen in the next local development plan. They do not really direct what's to happen in development management decisions at this point in time. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I come back to my position that the LDP's requirements will remain the LDP's requirements until there is no longer an LDP, until it's replaced by another LDP.
Okay.
So I don't know if it's helpful for your consideration, but in terms of just to bring some cheer to proceedings, I don't disagree with what Mr. MacLeod's interpretation is there. So I think we've got that agreement that he was looking for. That those are the two processes that we accept that NPF4 won't replace LDP. The next LDP will replace the LDP. The question for you, sir, is where you've got two parts of the development plan which essentially say different things, which one should take precedence. So I think we agree. If it speeds things up, I'm happy to agree that position. That what you have to interpret is in the assumption that Mr. MacLeod is right, and that we have NPF4, which is part of the development plan, in a few weeks' time from now. How are you going to interpret or determine the difference in those two documents? And the only bit of guidance that I would offer you, sir, in doing that is that the challenge thus far, almost the first thing that we said in the hearing today was that the land supply argument was an equation comparing the supply with the demand. The difference that you will have when NPF4 is approved, assuming that that is the case, is an up-to-date demand assessment, which will be part of the development plan, which is the deficiency that your colleagues have found elsewhere. They have not been prepared to accept the housing needs and demand assessment as being an up-to-date material consideration because it has not been part of the development plan. It will now be part of the development plan. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understood that. So the council's position is, bearing in mind that this question was about the weight to be given to the contribution, development's contribution to maintaining the 5-year housing land supply and the council's position is that there's no longer a requirement for a 5-year effect. I'm sorry, you have to explain it to me again, Mr. McCorson. I'm sorry, I didn't fully get it.
Yeah, I'll try, sir, and stop me at each part if that is helpful.
Just in terms of the housing land requirement, the council says the housing land requirement is not rolled forward from 2024. I'm right in understanding that.
That's correct.
Right. Okay. Because it's replaced by what exactly?
It is replaced by the minimum all-tenure housing land requirement,
right?
Which is set out in NPF4.
Right. Okay. I think let's keep discussion of that to item 7 on the agenda, shall we? But the council's position is effectively NPF4 comes in, the housing land requirement goes, and it's replaced by the minimum all-tenure housing land requirement.
That's correct, sir. And that minimum all tenure housing land requirement is informed by a housing needs and demand assessment, which is robust and credible and accepted by the Scottish ministers as being the most up-to-date evidence of housing demand in West Lothian.
Right.
And the point I was making, sir, was that your colleagues in the other appeals that we may or may not discuss later on have not accepted Honda as being Honda 2 or Honda 3 as being something with significant materiality because it has not been part of the development plan. But Honda 3 will now be part of the development plan, assuming that the figures from Honda 3 will be incorporated within the development plan. That's what the housing land requirement report addendum to NPF4 says.
So going back to the question about the weight to be given to the appellant's contribution to maintain the 5-year effective housing land supply or meeting the housing land requirement, it's not needed. Is the answer? Is your answer to that?
That's in short, so that's correct.
Okay, great. The application of tilted balance of SPTB to tilted balance. I think we've probably discussed most of the issues around this too. I'm sorry, I didn't give Mr. McLeod the appellant an opportunity to come back on this. Is there anything further you want to say on that agenda item?
Just one brief point, which is delighted to hear Mr. Corson's agreement, although I wasn't sure I understood the agreement ultimately, because I think what he said was the council accepts NPF4 will not replace the local development plan, and there's agreement from both sides on that part. I think what he's saying is, although it won't replace the local development plan, part of NPF4 will replace part of the LDP because the housing land requirement will change. I think he's saying the Maveler should be used instead of the housing land requirement. Maybe just clarify if I picked that up correctly.
So, sir, I'm happy to clarify that. I think we do agree that you can't replace part of an LDP. The LDP is the LDP. What you will have is two different approaches to calculating the housing land requirement. The one that is based on SPP and SDP1 and the LDP, with parts of which will fall. So SPP, SDP1 will fall and be replaced by NPF4. So you will have essentially two different approaches set out in the development plan. Neither of them are replaced because you can't replace that. But you, sir, have to, assuming that you're giving weight to NPF4, but a decision maker after NPF4 is approved will have to decide which of those approaches should be given precedence. And the council's position is that it is the most up-to-date component of the development plan that should take greatest precedence.
Well, I think we've opened the subject now, so I wonder if the easiest thing to do is actually now to skip to item 7 on the agenda, and we can come back to the other items if there's more to be said on them, given that we opened this subject. So that's an interesting point about the compatible, but isn't the question, Mr. McCorson, about the compatibility of the minimum all tenure housing land requirement with the housing land requirement in the local development plan. The housing land requirement, the minimum all tenure housing land requirement is a minimum. The housing land requirement in the local development plan is the current requirement. Surely there's no incompatibility between those two, so they can both continue. The housing land requirement remains in the local development plan, remains the requirement until such time as there another local development plan that replaces it. Is that not correct?
Well, that's not how I see it, sir.
Mm-hmm.
So the difficulty here, long-standing difficulty, is, and we're having it again, that there is no methodology for calculating that equation that we spoke about earlier on, the land requirement against the demand for housing. And fundamentally what the plan should be doing, in my view, is meeting the need for housing in full. You know, I'm not going to disagree with the appellants on that part. You know, the plan-led system should be establishing the demand and need for housing and should be planning to meet that in full. Now, we've had lots of challenges about how you do that. The Scottish Minister's position is clear, as far as I'm concerned, that the Scottish Ministers brought forward a plan to try and clarify the matter. They didn't pursue that. They then made changes to SPP in order to clarify that. We know that those changes fell, and the minister stated that it was not their intention to challenge that, but they would bring clarity forward through NPF4. So it seems to me that NPF4, amongst the many things that it seeks to do, seeks to clarify what the need for housing land is across.
Well, but surely they've done that in a particular way, and the way they've done it is to, as you say, they've referred to the Honda, they've worked out need and demand, they've calculated a figure on that basis, and they put it in the plan, and that's the key part. And you're saying that a plan-led system should cover the requirement for housing in full, I think is what you said. Well, there's a lot of judgment involved in that, and the ministers have made that judgment, and they have set a minimum requirement. And does that minimum not, and the council still has a development plan, a local development plan that includes a figure that is much higher than that for the housing land requirement. Is that not consistent with meeting a minimum requirement?
So it is consistent with meeting a minimum requirement for land, but it's not consistent with meeting a minimum requirement for completions, because the council has no control over those completions, and to perpetuate a position where additional land is being allocated because of a deficiency in house completions, which are firstly too high against all the evidence, and secondly not in the control of the council, is, in my view, inconsistent with the plan-led approach.
The answer to that is for West Lothian Council to bring forward another local development plan, and until at that time, isn't the present development plan development, the present local development plan and the figure in it part of the local development plan, assuming, as the appellant has argued, that the housing land requirement rolls forward.
Yeah, so it will be part of the development plan. I think we've confirmed that the parties agree to that. The housing requirement, the most up-to-date requirement will be set out in the upper tier of the development plan. That sets.
Well, that's what you said, but there's nothing inconsistent in having a minimum requirement and having a requirement. So the requirement in the local development plan would presumably carry on.
No, because it will carry on in terms of it being part of the development plan, but it is clearly sets a requirement which is much higher than the calculated requirement in the Honda and in the minimum all 10-year housing land requirement. So, for example, I think the figure in the LDP is, or the effective land, the allocated land is round about 20,000 units at the moment. The requirement for land is 9,600, 9,800 units over 10 years as set out in NPF4.
Yeah, no, I understand that. But what's your position as regards the interpretation? So the way I understand it, your position as regards the interpretation of the plan is that the housing land requirement remains part of the, as set presently in the local development plan, remains until that local development plan is replaced. But is that but it's a material consideration, perhaps, that the minimum housing land requirement set in accordance with the set having considered the Honda is much lower than that. Is that your position?
Yeah. So the housing land requirement will be there. So you know, the council is and that housing land requirement is met in numerical terms. So you know, when NPF4 is approved, the council is not suddenly going to dezone sites. It can't do that out with the development. So the housing land requirement will be there, but the question is how much of that land requirement has to come forward on an annual basis in order to meet demand for housing, and it's not the level of demand that we are currently being tested on through this appeal process. So that is, so the land requirement will be there, will continue to be there as a material consideration. The number of completions required in order to maintain an effective supply, however you calculate that supply, it's not going to be a 5-year supply. It's going to be a pipeline of sites which are set out in the response.
Effective is no longer a word, it'll be deliverable.
Say that again, sorry, I missed that.
Effective is no longer a word, it's
yeah,
deliverable.
Exactly. So you know, that whole thing about the effective supply disappears. So what is the, as you say, what is the deliverable part of that land requirement that is set out in the LDP? So that will continue to be there, but there is no testing of the deficiency of that, and therefore no provision for invoking policy how-to insofar as that continues to exist. Policy 7 clearly will fall at the point that NPF4 is adopted. So policy 7 is gone. Policy how-to will continue to be there, but the requirement will be tested against the minimum land requirement that the council is required to bring forward through NPF4.
Where in NPF4 does it say that the minimum land requirement is the test?
It's.
Or sorry, are you saying it's a material consideration, or are you saying
it's a material consideration? So, so in NPF4 sets that requirement. That the report addendum sets out that figure in NPF4 has been tested against the most up-to-date needs and assessment for land, and it sets essentially a land requirement for housing. Now, the council will, by any measure, significantly exceed that requirement from day one of NPF4 being adopted. So the question for you, sir, is on what basis would you seek to bring forward or allow an unallocated site against those sets of circumstances where the council will significantly exceed the land requirement set out in the development plan?
I think I'll put that question to Mr. McLeod. But I'm sorry, I kind of launched into the middle of this section. I'll give Mr. McLeod an opportunity to respond to that. But perhaps we should confirm the legal framework for NPF4 after that, and make sure that we're clear where we're going, and how NPF4 works in relation to test plan and the local development plan. Yeah. Okay, Mr. McLeod, if you want to respond to Mr. McCorson, then we can go on to the legal framework.
Yeah, very happy to do that, sir. And it may actually assist if I set out the legal framework first, because there are a couple of points from.
Perhaps that's the thing to do then.
Yeah, a couple of points from some things that Mr. McCorson said that might benefit from clarity around the legal framework. Mm-hmm. And it's probably also worthwhile having a copy of policy 16 of NPF4 available.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Shortly. So that's it's page 62 of the paper copy, which will be about page.
I think I have it open at that.
You got it. Okay. So for ease of comprehension, let's just assume that NPF4 is adopted in its current form in the next few weeks, and also let's assume that that's before you issue your decision in this case, which I think is probably a reasonable assumption. At that point in time, NPF4 will become the top tier of the development plan. The West Lothian LDP will remain the lower tier of the local development plan. The CESS plan will no longer be part of the development plan unless ministers decide to save any of its policies, which is a power available to them, but not one that I understand they intend to use. But you will have two parts of the development plan, which the appellant says do slightly different things at this point in time. Mm-hmm. Now, I'll come on to what those are in just a moment, but Mr. McCorson referenced the fact that the Mathler figure in NPF4 will be a material consideration. It will not. It will be part of the development plan. And therefore, when you come to do your assessment, you need to look at that part of the development plan, the West Lothian local development plan, and then decide what collectively they mean sitting together. You can't then, as Mr. McCorson encourages you to do, you can't bring in the Mathler figure in some this may be what he's trying to do. You can't bring it in some sort of alternative way as another material consideration, because that would involve double counting. And there's a case on that subject called Aberdeenshire Council against Scottish ministers that I'll be referring.
That'd be helpful, yeah.
Yeah, I'll refer to that in my closing submissions. And I think Aberdeenshire Council against Scottish ministers. It's from about 10 or so years ago. I don't have the citation, but I'll certainly be referring to that in closing submissions, and I can send you and the council an advance copy of the case so that you can have a think about it in advance. And in essence, what that case says is that when you come to consider the development plan and what other material considerations are, other material considerations are something different to what's in the LDP or this, in this case, NPF4. They are what the court described as factors that are external to the making up of the development plan itself. So, as Mr. McCorson rightly says, ministers have taken account of the Honda 3, and they've decided to do something with it. They've decided to embed it into policy that's in NPF4, and you will then need to decide what that policy means for the purpose of this proposal. And I'll maybe turn to that next. So if you start with the leave aside the policy intent and outcomes for the time being, although we may want to come back to them. If you look at local development plans, the section just underneath, LDPs are expected to identify a local housing land requirement for the area they cover. The first point to note there is the term local housing land requirement.
It's above clause 16,
Yeah, that's right. So local housing land requirement is a brand new term, and it's what the next round of NPF4 compliant LDPs must produce.
Mm-hmm.
And the NPF tells us that it's to meet the duty for the housing target and to represent how much land is required, and that to promote an ambitious and plan-led approach, the LHLR is expected to exceed the 10-year Mathler that's set out in Annex E.
Mm-hmm.
So the one thing that we know with certainty is that the Mathler figure set out in NPF4 is not going to be the number against which anything is measured, because ministers fully expect the next local development plan to exceed those figures. They're promoting an ambitious approach. What that number will be,
so
we don't know.
The Mathler is essentially a direction to the local development plan. It's not something directly to be applied in development management. Is that what you're saying?
Spot on, sir. Yes, that couldn't put that better myself. You then have a section which goes on to talk about deliverable land, 10-year, again, local housing land requirement, how that's to be addressed within LDPs, the need for short-term, medium-term, long-term sites, all within the context of a deliverable housing land pipeline. All of those are concepts for the next LDP. They have no relevance at this stage to decision-making. And so what I say is, at this point in time, NPF tells us nothing about the approach that it says you should take to assessing this appeal.
Mm-hmm.
We say you have to rely on the LDP as things stand at the moment. Now, Mr. McCorson is keen to point out the issue of compatibility between NPF4 and the LDP. And again, just to put that in context, and again, I'll refer to this in submissions.
So just to be clear, the development plan, so far as the LDP and the NPF4 are incompatible, it's the later one that applies. Yeah,
that's correct, sir. We say at this stage there is no incompatibility between the LDP and NPF4. And I remember when I saw those words in the 2019 Act, actually going and checking what the word incompatible or incompatibility means. And what it means is it's two things that are so different that neither can exist when the other one is there. Now, that's not the situation that we have here. We have an LDP that can continue because it has a self-contained policy framework for delivering housing to meet an agreed housing land requirement. And then we have another part of the development plan which tells local authorities what they should do when replacing LDPs such as the West Lothian Local Development Plan.
Mm-hmm.
And once the council has followed the guidance or requirements set out in NPF4, it will produce an NPF4 compliant LDP. That LDP will replace the existing West Lothian Development Plan. Until that happens, the West Lothian LDP will remain the primary guiding part of the development plan for development management decisions.
Is there anything relevant in the you mentioned the process for replacing LDPs? Is there anything relevant in that you need to mention, or is that?
Well,
I just wanted to break it down. I wanted to give Mr. McCarson an opportunity to come back So I was wondering if you were going to go on and describe that process, or if that's more or less your conclusion.
I'll mention one thing briefly, sir, which is that the new LDP, again, I think it's fairly obvious from the text of NPF4, but the new LDP cannot simply be based on the existing Honda, because the NPF4 tells us that ministers expect the new LDP to go beyond the Honda.
Mm-hmm.
And what that's likely to involve is a reassessment, and a more thorough reassessment than the Honda does at the moment, because there are various issues with what need and demand the Honda measures and what it doesn't. That's been the subject of endless debate. But there is an expectation that the council will have to do more, and it will have to produce an evidence report which will set out its conclusions on what need and demand is required. And people will be entitled to comment on that. And one of your colleagues in due course will have to examine the sufficiency of the evidence report. So there's a bit of work to be done before we work out what the true level of need and demand in West Lothian is. And again, maybe just to finish one brief point on this. If it was as simple as saying that local authorities were to base their next LDP requirements specifically on a housing need and demand assessment that had been signed off as robust and credible, the methodology of which had been signed off as robust and credible by Centre for Housing Market Analysis, the NPF would have said so. It would have been clear in its policy that that was the basic requirement for LDPs, and it does not do that. It leaves the matter open for further debate and scrutiny in due course, taking account of further evidence sources. It's not as simple as saying that Honda 3 is the number that you should now be focused on. It is not.
Okay. Mr. McCarson, do you want to respond to that?
Yes, sir. Thanks, I will. And I'll maybe start with the last point made by Mr. MacLeod there, which was about the status of Honda 3, and it is not the basis of the calculation or the process set out in NPF4. So how the housing land requirement report addendum to NPF4 is very clear to me. It says,
yeah, so should we go to that and have a look at it? So it's Appendix E, is it? We're talking about.
It is.
Or are we talking about a separate document? Sorry.
Yeah, it's a separate document that's part of the.
Yeah, it's document 39.
39.
So, thanks, Mr. MacLeod.
Right. And that was produced. So that was produced for the draft NPF4, not for the revised draft. Is that right?
No, this is for the revised draft. So it was published on the 8th of November 2022, at the same time as NPF4 was laid before Parliament. And it's really just to look at, firstly, the introduction, which says in the from the second sentence, in finalising the mailers, we have continued to use an evidence-based approach to refine the figures. So there's been a bit of work done on these figures in the interim. For those instances where a local authority has completed a new housing needs and demand assessment since draft NPF4 was published, where applicable, information from this has been used to update the existing need input. So it's very clear to me that the Scottish ministers see the calculation of housing need as being based on firstly the mailer, but secondly the update to that, where that has been informed by a housing needs and demand assessment. And then in the body of the document itself, it identifies those authorities who have completed an updated Honda between the draft and finalised. And you'll see in the from last page just the West Lothian figures there. I don't intend to go into the figures, but it was just to set out.
I think I've been directed to the wrong. I think this the document 39 isn't the right document, is it?
You have. My apologies for that. So it's document 38.
38.
Yeah. Apologies for that.
It's okay. Introduction. Based approach to refining the figures, and then we go to where were we looking at the housing land requirement explanatory report.
Yeah.
Can you just tell me where you're pointing me to, Mr. Corson?
Yeah. So it was really just to so the introduction to that document just explains that the Scottish Minister's thinking in terms of the mailer has been informed by an evidence-based approach to the figures.
Yeah, got
so,
that. Yeah.
You know, these are not figures that are plucked out of thin air. They're evidence-based. They're based on the most up-to-date evidence. So, you know, the third sentence in the introduction there, for those instances where a local authority, as in West Lothian Council's case, has completed a new housing needs and demand assessment since the draft NPF, the first draft NPF-4 was published, where applicable, information from this has been used to update existing need inputs. So it is clear to me, sir, that this is the Scottish Ministers accepting that this is the most up-to-date position in terms of housing needs in West Lothian. And then later on in the document, we don't have to look at the figures at this point in time, but it gives that the mailer figure for West Lothian and breaks that down into the 4 components of how that's been established.
Right. Okay.
So Scottish Ministers, in my view, accepting that this is the level of demand for housing that we should be planning for in a plan-led system in Scotland.
So how does this assist me? Does this assist me in interpreting the development plan, so NPF or the future development plan, NPF-4 alongside the local development plan, or does it assist me, or is it something else? Is it material consideration?
Well, I would hope it would be both, sir. So in terms of interpreting the figures in the existing local plan, the allocated sites in the existing local plan, and remember that there are some 20,000 land for some 20,000 houses identified in the existing local development plan. I would ask you, sir, to consider, and I'll come on to the need for flexibility and additional allowances, etc. I would ask you to consider whether, in terms of the emerging planning position, that is sufficient land to meet the minimum all tenure housing land requirement, which is now the most up-to-date assessment of demand for housing.
Mm.
And you know, maybe just to point out as part of that figure of 9,850 is a 10-year figure, which 9,850 per year if you were to calculate it that way. But that already includes a flexibility of 25%. So there's already a significant allowance built in for flexibility. All the Hondas historically have identified, with the exception of
That's
Honda.
what that table shows. Yeah, I see.
Yeah.
Flexibility 25%.
Yeah. So it has a figure for existing need in there. It has a figure for housing growth over the next 10 years.
That's the kind of production of new households predicted.
Yeah. So just natural growth, if you will, or household formation is 9,650. So that is the demand that we need to be planning for over the coming years. So there's the existing need figure of 1,400. That's actually a figure which, ironically, the council argued up in terms of the consultation on this document, because there is a significant level of homelessness in West Lothian, as there is across the whole of Scotland now, and to reflect the number of presentations which we get as a local authority in terms of homelessness, then we thought that the starting point for the calculation needed to be a little bit higher.
I see that in the document. Yeah.
So that's how those figures are calculated based on the most up-to-date position. Now, I would ask you, sir, is with that position, is it really credible that what we're required to do is build out the 19,811 houses which are identified in the housing requirement in the LDP before we start to deliver these 9,600 houses? That, from the council's perspective, is clearly not how it should work, because that would be planning for a demand figure which is hugely in excess of the actual requirement.
Well, but I'm not sure that that's necessarily what the appellant is saying. I mean, with the appellant, we can go back to the appellant on that. But I was interested in what the appellant had argued, that the minimum, the MAFLR is a minimum, the housing land requirement carries on, and LDPs are expected to identify a local housing land requirement for the area they cover, and it's promote an ambitious and plan-led approach. The local housing land requirement is expected to exceed the 10-year minimum or 10-year housing land requirement. So we know that ultimately, when there's a new local development plan that includes a local housing land requirement, it will be bigger than the MAFLR. That's in policy terms. That's all we know at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah. So we can agree that is. So it's an expectation rather than an absolute requirement, I should say. But I think a sensible local authority would seek to meet that expectation.
Expectation,
yeah, it's not a requirement. It's an expectation, and of course, it's an expectation that is already on top of the 25% flexibility allowance, which it was in there. So it's flexibility on top of flexibility.
But the thing is, we don't know what the council will do at this stage.
We don't.
And until, as I understand it, until that happens, the LDP continues, and the housing land requirement in the LDP continues, does it not?
Well, that's not the so. Yeah, it continues in terms of it being, as I said previously, a requirement to allocate that amount of land, so that continues. The council won't suddenly dezone land, as I said previously, so that requirement continues. Mm-hmm. The question is, how much of that land requirement has to be delivered, and is there a deficiency in that delivery? Now,
but all of it has to be delivered until the policy is replaced, doesn't it? Or
I think, yeah, well, depending on what weight you place on the considerations that are coming forward. So it's when NPF4 is, as we anticipate, approved.
But it's not really a matter of weight. It's a matter of what's in the development plan. I mean, I can put different weight on things, and I can put different, but I have to find out what the development plan means first.
Yes.
So as a matter of the development plan, your position is the housing land requirement continues. That's correct?
So the requirement to allocate that amount of land continues.
Mm-hmm.
What changes is how much of that land has to be delivered in order to meet current housing need.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the change to the need side of the equation as opposed to the supply side of it. So the supply side continues. The Honda changes the need side of the equation, and that has to be a material consideration.
Okay. I'll give Mr. McLeod an opportunity to come back on that, and then we can maybe move on to the question of, well, I suppose there's two questions that come out from that discussion. One is the continuation of, well, I suppose they're interlinked. It's the continuation of policy HOU2 and what that means in terms of what's required under that. I think. And the second question is about policy 16 and what that means, and whether there's any incompatibility between policy 16 and policy HOU2. Okay, but I'll give Mr. McLeod an opportunity to come back on what Mr. McCorson has said so far.
I think I can be very brief, sir, and I don't want to repeat myself. I think you've got a position fairly clearly, but Mr. McCorson again said at the end, the HNDA changes the demand side, and that is a material consideration. It is not. As a matter of law, it will not be a material consideration once NPF4 is approved, because the HNDA and I take no issue with what Mr. McCorson was saying about the introduction of the housing land requirement explanatory report addendum. The ministers did take account of Honda 3. There's no question about that at all. But what they did was they took account of it, and they then decided that the correct policy response was to tell local authorities that they had an expectation that they would go on and exceed the figure that is derived entirely from Honda 3. So, in other words, the Honda 3 and the evidence that ministers received as part of the NPF4 process, that sets the floor beneath which no LDP can go. There is then the expectation from ministers that there will be an ambitious plan-led approach where the local housing land requirement is expected to exceed the 10-year figure. And there is an opportunity as part of that LDP process to take account of a whole variety of things. So, for example, the explanatory report addendum that we were looking at, the foot of page 1, when it talks about, this is in the Edinburgh context, so you'll see the final paragraph reference to the Honda Practitioner's Guide. This advises that the use of a count of households both concealed and overcrowded represents a minimum count of this type of existing need, and the Honda guidance invites local authorities to amend this if they wish. So,
sorry, can you just give me that reference again? It was Practitioner Guide, Honda Practitioner Guide. That for us?
So it's not, and frankly, you don't want to read that if you can possibly avoid it. The point I was trying to make is a more general one, which is the explanatory report recognises that there are opportunities to take account of other evidence sources, for example, further counts of household need and so on. But that's really all for the future. That's for the next round of local development plans to decide whether they want to do that, for other parties to have an opportunity to comment on it, and ultimately for a reporter to decide whether the evidence report that the council produces to justify its local housing land requirement, which will be a number that's important in due course. The reporter will have to reach a view on whether the evidence report is sufficient to justify that requirement figure that the council is aiming for. The MATLR is simply, as you put it, simply a guide to the next local development plan. It cannot have any relevance to the existing LDP at all.
Okay. Well, if we move on to the next point, so the appellant's position, as I understand it, is that policy HOU 2 continues. So the effect of it. So does anyone? Are we needing a break, or is there? No, okay.
It's okay.
Right. The appellant's position, as I understand it, is that policy HOU 2 continues. The housing land requirement in the current local development plan continues, and therefore the appellant's case is that the housing land requirement must ultimately be met, and therefore moving forward the 5-year housing land requirement will be set accordingly, taking into account any shortfall, just as we've discussed. Is that's effectively your position? Is it? Yeah. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, sir, it is.
Yeah. Okay. Right. So, looking at, but I guess my question is that compatible with policy 16?
It is. Because
it is or it isn't. Sorry, I didn't get that.
Sorry, it is.
It is.
Yes, it is. Policy 16. I mean, the most obvious part of policy 16, where on the face of it there may be a conflict, and the council has fortunately fallen into this trap as well, is policy 16F.
Yeah.
So policy 16. That was Mr. Salter coming back in, just so you knew. So policy 16F, if you have that, that's on page 63. And that says development proposals for new homes on land not allocated for housing in the LDP will only be supported in limited circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
So you'll have seen our hearing statement, and the question that we pose and then answer in that hearing statement is, what is meant by the LDP?
Mm-hmm.
Now we say it is not the current adopted LDP, and it cannot be the current adopted LDP, because the criteria in policy 16F require measurement of the land supply against the deliverable housing land pipeline. Deliverable housing land pipeline, as we've seen, is a concept that is linked entirely to new NPF4 compliant LDPs and has no place in the existing LDP. So when the policy F 16F has to be read as a whole, you can't simply cherry pick some criteria and say, well, that doesn't apply at the moment. It has to be applied as one self-contained framework, and because of that, it cannot be applied at the moment, which points very strongly to the fact that when it talks about land not allocated for housing in the LDP, it's the LDP of the future.
Well, okay. I'll give Mr. McCorson an opportunity to comment on that. I wonder, just for clarity, if I took the LDP to mean the existing LDP, then that policy would effectively say that, taking the first bullet of point 3 of that policy, delivery of sites happening earlier than identified in deliverable housing land pipeline. Sorry, let's just get the full sentence. Development proposals for new homes on land not allocated for housing in the LDP will only be supported in limited circumstances where delivery of sites is happening earlier than identified in deliverable housing land pipeline. So if there's no deliverable housing land pipeline, then that exception doesn't apply. Policy as a whole can apply, as long as I interpret the LDP to mean the current LDP.
Well,
It's not that the policy is rendered ineffective, is what I'm asking. It's simply that because there's no housing land pipeline, that exception doesn't apply.
Well, it's a critical part of the policy. It's a critical part of the policy because we can debate whether parts 1 and 2 are addressed by this proposal. We say they are, not that it's relevant. But then you come on to part 3 and looking at the others, policy on rural homes, not relevant in this case.
No.
Proposal for smaller scale opportunities within existing settlement boundary, not relevant.
Mm-hmm.
Proposals for delivery of less than 50 affordable homes, again, not relevant. So the first bullet point is critical. And when you look at what the policy is trying to achieve, delivery of sites is happening earlier than identified in the deliverable housing land pipeline.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what that's trying to address is the new style of LDP where the council allocates deliverable land.
I got that
certain. Yeah. So they allocate certain categories of deliverable land, something that this LDP does not do.
Yeah.
And you then measure performance against all of that. Now, those are not concepts that are relevant to the existing LDP.
No, indeed.
And policy 60F cannot therefore apply to it.
Well, one interpretation is that the policy doesn't apply. Another interpretation is that exception doesn't apply.
Well, my primary submission, sir, is the interpretation that it does apply to existing LDPs is wrong as a matter of law. And secondly, building on that, the reason for that is there is a self-contained policy framework in Policy F, which sets out the circumstances in which unallocated land in the LDP can come forward. And those circumstances reference criteria in the LDP of the future, not the LDP of the present. So this policy is not intended to apply at this point in time. And that, I say, is clear as a matter of law.
But it's only that bullet that references matters in the LDP of the future, isn't it? That's the only part that references something that would be in the future LDP.
That is correct, but it's a fundamental part of the policy framework.
So, is there not? Well, I guess the question is, why is that fundamental part of the policy framework? I'm not quite getting that from your. Why is that so fundamental? There's to be an right to allocate to get the to determine whether sites should be brought forward. You have to have reference to consecutive years of housing land audit, evidencing substantial delivery earlier than the pipeline. I mean, you wouldn't. Yeah, I mean, I suppose that goes towards your point, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, the short answer is it's a fundamental part of the policy because ministers have decided that's the way it should be written.
Mm-hmm.
Ministers have decided that in the future, once LDPs have properly allocated deliverable sites of different categories, in the future, you should stick to the plan. And according to 16F, it will only be if you see more housing coming forward than was assumed to be deliverable that would justify release. So it's a different policy approach, but critically, it's a different policy approach for the LDPs of the future. Once they have gone through that exercise of the evidence report, the allocation of an ambitious local housing land requirement, and crucially, the identification of a deliverable land pipeline in 3 categories of short, medium, and long term.
So you graduate as Minister's policy intention that there should be exceptional releases until such time as a new LDP is brought forward. Exceptional releases under the local development plan until such time as a new LDP replaces that.
Well, the point, sir, is that until such time as a new LDP replaces the old LDP, any release policy in the old LDP will continue to apply, because that's an appropriate framework. It will have been signed off by ministers as part of the adoption process. Ministers have then produced NPF4, which says, in the future, LDPs should do things differently. This is how we want them to do things differently. Once that new LDP is in place, the release policy set out in policy 16F will be appropriate. That is the way that things will be done post new LDP adoption. But it cannot be used at the moment.
Okay. If that was, well, obviously you're not saying that was Minister's intention. You've said it's a different policy approach in the old LDP. How does that fit together with Minister's decision to abolish the strategic development plans at the same time as bringing NPF4 in, and therefore the housing targets that were, or the housing supply targets and the housing land requirements that were in the strategic development plan? Doesn't that indicate an intention on the part of ministers to change policy direction when the national planning framework came in, and therefore to apply a policy that restricts development except on allocated sites?
No, because if that was the case, then they would have done something so far as the LDP is concerned as well. The LDP retains a self-contained framework again, which retains the existing housing land requirement figures, the existing policy, and it's important to.
But just before you go on, they have done something in respect of the LDP. They've said that insofar as incompatible, insofar as there's incompatibility between national planning framework and the LDP, it's the later one that prevails. And if policy 16 restricts development other than allocated sites, is that not an incompatibility?
No, because the policy does not apply to existing LDPs.
Well,
when that is our interpretations.
Okay. Hey, Mr. McCorson. I'm sorry, just going back, the just in terms of I'm not sure I got your full answer on in terms of any intention that might be shown by ministers by the abolition of SDPs and the housing targets and housing land requirement within them. Did you complete that answer?
So I think all that I can say is that the policy requirements of the SDPs will disappear when they are replaced by National Planning Framework 4. Policy requirements of the local development plans will continue on and must continue on until such time as they're replaced. Now, if ministers wanted to abolish the targets altogether, they could have taken an entirely different approach, which is to say that NPF4 would supersede all strategic development plans and all local development plans so far as these issues are concerned. And they could have set out a local housing requirement for each local authority, but they haven't done that. What they've done is they've said SDPs will go, LDPs will stay. We're setting an ambitious plan-led approach for local housing land requirements in the future. And in due course, the LDPs will set out that strategy, and these policies can then apply.
Mr. McCorson.
Thanks, sir. So I think most of what needs to be said has already been said. I mean, I think we can agree that the SDP will be abolished. We can agree that there's provision for NPF4 to take precedence after that. I think we should also recognise that it's not only SDP that goes, but it's SPP as well, Scottish Planning Policy, and much of what we've already talked about today is derived from the requirements set out in SPP. So it's a significant consideration that those requirements will no longer be set out in SPP. And we've talked about the requirements for housing not disappearing as a result of NPF4 being approved, but NPF4 says nothing about the actual need for completions. There's no equivalent of the effective 5-year land supply out there, so you have nothing to base the effectiveness of that supply. And of course, you can't turn to SPP because SPP will have gone, and you can't turn to SDP because SDP will have gone. So, sir, what do you do in those circumstances? I think you need to go back to Policy 16 and establish exactly what Policy 16 is trying to achieve. And it's fairly clear because helpfully the Scottish ministers have set the policy outcomes at the start of Policy 16, and they're on page 62 of draft NPF4, where it sets the policy intent and the policy outcomes. And the second policy outcome is the provision of land in the right location to accommodate future need and demand for new housing, supported by the appropriate infrastructure. So we're looking to meet the demand for new homes. The process requires us to over-allocate land rather than just calculate this or work to the specific need. And that's where the whole local housing land requirement comes from. So irrespective, sir, of whether Policy 16 can be applied before the LDP is in place or after the LDP is in place, I think I would ask you to consider in any circumstances, can the council meet the requirements set out in the second paragraph on the local development plans? Deliverable land should be allocated to meet the 10-year local housing land requirement in locations that create quality places for people to live. So can the council achieve that requirement? We've got land for nearly 20,000 houses allocated. I accept that's not a local housing land requirement, but part of that could easily become the local housing land requirement. And we have a minimum all 10-year housing land requirement figure of 9,600. So is the minister's expectation to over-allocate really one that the over-allocation would be more than double the land that is already identified? I don't think that would be a reasonable expectation for that requirement. But I'll conclude by two references to LDP. I see the references in Policy 16 being a little bit challenging for the decision maker, whether that's you, me, or anybody else. But it talks about LDPs in plural. For example, Policy 16A talks about LDPs in plural. Elsewhere, it talks about them being singular. But irrespective of the arguments that we've already rehearsed long and hard today, I do come to policy 16F. Irrespective of whether this is a reference to the new LDP or the existing LDP or any other LDP, it is a matter of fact that the site is not allocated in the LDP for development. Either the existing LDP, who knows what the future LDP will do, but it is a matter of fact it is not allocated for development. A matter of fact from the council's perspective that it is not required to meet the policy objectives set out by the Scottish ministers, and that it is not needed to accommodate future need and demand for new houses. So, the interpretation and the precedence that's given to policy will be determined by decision makers in the courts potentially in the future. But the fact from the council's perspective is that this site is not needed to meet future demand for new housing.
So in policy 16, you referred to LDPs where LDPs is used in plural and where it's used in singular. So can you just explain what you drew from that? Is it anything?
Yeah, so it's just policy 16A. Development proposals for new homes on land allocated for housing in LDPs will be supported. Now, that might be talking about LDPs across the whole of Scotland, because clearly we would only have one LDP in West Lothian. But is this a reference to the existing LDP and the future LDP? So is it allocated for housing now? Is it allocated for housing in the future? I think that comes back to the first part of 16F. The answer is no on either of those.
So 16F refers to the LDP.
Yep.
And 16A refers to in LDPs.
Yeah. So as I say, just to reiterate, is that the current LDP and the future LDP?
Okay. All right. Just sorry, Mr. McLeod, do you want to come back on that? And I do have one more question on this topic, and then we can maybe finish off the other topics.
Well, why don't you ask your question, sir? And that my point might be addressed by that.
Right. It was really both parties. I mean, it was simply if I were to decide this appeal before, for whatever reason, the national planning framework comes in, how should I treat the revised draft of the planning framework? Is it simply a question of considering the criterion on prejudice in NSPP, or is there anything else I should take into account?
In terms of prematurity, etc.
Sorry?
In terms of prematurity.
In terms of prematurity, that's right. In paragraph, I think 34, is it?
Yes, I mean, ultimately, I think given where we are, we probably have to accept that NPF4 should be given a significant amount of weight. We will know, I think, before the end of the year, whether the Parliament has endorsed it. And once we have the Parliament's view, I think it'll be fairly clear what's going to happen next. But I suspect in practice the issue may not arise. But yes, if you were able to issue your decision before then, I think prematurity probably would be the only consideration. Noting, of course, that once SPP goes, prematurity disappears as a concept from Scottish planning policy, as does the concept of out-of-date plans.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, Carson, do you want to add to that?
So I'm happy to support pretty much everything which Mr. MacLeod said there in terms of what the process will be. With absolute no disrespect to yourself, sir, I think it's a racing certainty that there's going to be a decision on NPF4 one way or t'other before before you reach your decision on this, because I'm anticipating that we've still to have another hearing session. I'm not sure that a date has been set for that, and then I would assume that there would be a requirement for a developer obligation as part of this, which again is going to take us beyond the time in which the Scottish Parliament is working to have the vote on NPF4 itself. And then my understanding is working towards, subject to the positive outcome in that vote, working towards implementation by the end of January. Sorry, adoption by the end of January.
Okay. Right. There were a couple of other things on the agenda that, sorry, there were a couple of other things on the agenda that I'd skipped over. The application of SPP's tilted balance. I think I understand the party's position on this. SPP disappears, so the tilted balance will disappear with NPF4 in any case. Is there anything that parties want to say further on SPP and the tilted balance?
Not from the council's perspective, sir.
No, I don't think so, sir. Thank you.
Okay. I think we've covered the relevance of other figures on housing need and demand. I don't think we need to go there again. Mr. McCorson, do you want to say anything more on that? No. Okay.
We're happy to rest on that.
Consistency with other reporter decisions. Quite a number of decisions have been cited to be. Does anyone want to say anything further on those? I do have a few notes, but perhaps your panel can go first. Is there anything you want to draw to my attention other in the decisions that you've cited to me in particular?
It's a general observation, sir, that it's somewhat curious that the council wants you to rely heavily on 2 appeal decisions in Edinburgh, but wants you to ignore the 7 or so that have gone against the council in relation to West Lothian and its own local development plan. But beyond that, nothing further at this stage.
7 or so. Mr. McCarson? What you're beyond me, Mr. McCarson.
My apologies. I was trying to say Matthew Watson will just make a short submission on it.
Okay.
So, the main thing is that we just re-emphasise our position in the hearing statement. That's that in the context of not being able to calculate a 5-year effective housing land supply, the decisions that we have quoted are the approach that we believe that you should take, that being the South East Wedge and the Garden District decisions in this instance. And there should be reasoning given if you wish to depart from those decisions.
Mm-hmm.
There's one brief clarification that I just wanted to bring up for the appellant's hearing statement. They referenced at paragraph 2176 that one of the key decisions they're referencing is the East Calder decision, document 29 in the council's submission. and that relates to application of policy how-to and presumption in favour of development contributes to sustainable development. And on the latter point, I'm taking that by inference about tilted balance as well. In the East Calder decision, and I'm just going to briefly quote from paragraph 35 of that. I agree with the opinion by the reporter in paragraph 30 above that.
If just give me a moment to get hold of it.
Yep, no problem.
Is notice of intention document 29, isn't it?
Yes.
Right, and it's paragraph, sorry,
35.
35. Yeah.
So in the absence of an up-to-date housing land requirement, it's not possible to make a definitive finding on the extent of any housing land shortfall in West Lothian, and therefore on the angle of tilt in favour of the proposed development. The appellant is saying that this is one of the key decisions you should follow, but they're saying there's a substantial tilt in favour of their development. That's paragraph 2.142 and paragraph 2.143 of their statement. So I'm just looking for a bit of clarity as to whether they agreeing with the approach that the reporter in that case has taken, in that he's not been able to define any angle of tilt, notwithstanding the council disagrees there being a shortfall. But do they agree that there's an angle of tilt here or not, or do they disagree with the decision they quoted at East Calder?
Well, in paragraph 35, Reporter Shields says, nevertheless, I conclude that the evidence indicates that there is such a shortfall, not least because of the continuing deficiency in the supply of housing land that has been identified since before the West Lothian Local Development Plan was adopted. I think that there's a general approach that I think you can take from all of these appeal decisions, sir, and it's come up a bit during the discussions we've had this morning. There is real difficulty in knowing what the housing land requirement figure beyond 2024 will be, because it's not set. And various parties in various appeals have tried to argue that you should use housing and demand assessment, other evidence, all as a proxy for the housing land requirement. And I think when you read the decisions as a whole, where you generally get to is no reporter has been happy with that approach. All reporters have decided, in effect, that you need to focus on the figure to 2024 and that it's not appropriate to go beyond 2024. And so I think when Reporter Sheila is saying that it is difficult because of an up-to-date housing land requirement, etc., it has to be read in the context of paragraph 33, where he's talking about it's difficult knowing what assumptions can be made about the HLR beyond the planned period of CES plan, i.e. 2024. So I suppose in summary, I'm not saying anything different to what we've said earlier on today, which is housing land requirement to 2024 remains the most important figure at this point in time. You need to do something to try and meet that as quickly as you can. And that invariably or inevitably means having a strong, effective housing land supply over the next 5 years. What will happen with housing land requirements in the future will be for the next LDP.
Well, what do you say then to, I'm sorry, perhaps, Mr. Watson, are you content with that?
We've covered, in response to what Mr. McLeod said, we've covered all of that in the last few hours. So I don't think there's anything more I need to add beyond what we have already said.
And in terms of the two CES plan cases, the two Edinburgh cases, there is a finding there that there's three cases that have been referred to. Two are the South East Wedge, and the other is the Garden District. And in each case, it's found the cess plan housing policies are out of date. Now, fair enough, if there may be a different situation in West Lothian, but how can I make a finding that the cess plan housing policies are otherwise than out of date in West Lothian, or is it relevant that they're out of date?
I suspect, to echo what Mr. McCorriston was saying earlier, by the time you come to write up your decision, that may not matter because cess plan's unlikely to exist. Point that we made in our hearing statement is, again, reading in the round, in the Edinburgh cases, the reporters and the minister found that the housing land requirement had been satisfied in Edinburgh. Position is very different in Westwood, where at least 7 reporters have found that there will be a substantial shortfall in delivering the housing land requirement. And again, come back to the point that I started on at the beginning, which is this local development plan was only adopted in 2018. It was adopted with amendments that were made by one of your colleagues to ensure that policy how-to operated regularly if required in order to deliver the housing land requirement. And the minister was very clear in that direction that he issued that he wanted more action to be taken. It may be worth, if I may, just inviting through you, if the council could answer one simple question, which is, since the local development plan was adopted, how many planning applications has it authorised itself using policy how-to?
Well, if the council has that figure to hand, that might be of interest, but I don't think it's essential for determination of the appeal. Do you have that figure to hand?
Sir, I certainly don't have that figure to hand. If you think it would be of benefit to do so, we can certainly pull that figure together. What I can say, if the suggestion from Mr. MacLeod is that we have not used that as a justification, I don't want to put words into his mouth. But what I can say as a matter of fact that we have used it as a justification, not least for the council's own house building programme, where we have we've allocated some sites with HOU2 as a justification because of the very particular difficulty with delivering affordable housing land. But we can certainly pull that information together. So, you know, I don't really want to go back in here again. I will. You know, Mr. MacLeod consistently has come back to what the reporter said in the LDP, exactly reporters, I should say, in the LDP examination, together with all of the references which he has already made. There is one significant reference in there, which is that the basis of, and we can get you the reference to this, the basis of their findings was on the assumption that SDP2 was coming forward. Now we know what happened ultimately with that, but the expectation was that because the SDP2 was already at an advanced stage by that stage, and that the expectation was that the housing requirement coming forward through SDP2 would be significantly reduced. Now that didn't happen, as we know. That doesn't change the fact that the housing demand figures using other evidence sources are significantly less than SDP1 and LDP1 were based upon.
Right. There's there was one other, and Mr. Clyde can maybe come back to that in his answer. There was one other case. The two Southeast Wedge cases found that because the local because the CES plan requirement was out of date, housing land requirement was out of date, the local development plan housing land requirement was also out of date. Is that not a relevant consideration also here?
Who's that one for, sir?
That's for you, Mr. McLeod.
From back to the point I made earlier on, which is you have, in terms of numerics here, you have 3 Edinburgh decisions where the decision maker decided that housing requirement figures were out of date, predominantly because the appellants or applicants in those cases were arguing that you should look beyond the housing land requirement figure. So the decision makers found that the housing land requirement was going to be delivered in Edinburgh. The applicants and appellants said, well, be that as it may, you need to look beyond the figure in the LDP. And that's where decision makers were uncomfortable. So they relied on the fact that the plan was out of date because the numbers were potentially relied on the fact that the plan was out of date because the numbers were being met.
Not in every case, though. The refusal of the Uphall application, that didn't express a view, but certainly others, and I think this Calder decision was based on that assumption, wasn't it?
Well, again, I think in the round, the various West Lothian decisions all found that there is a significant shortfall that still requires to be addressed. Now, some of those are very recent decisions where the arguments that we've discussed this morning were rehearsed, albeit in writing. And the vast majority of your colleagues, if not all, have decided that the West Lothian figures remain relevant. And again, I say that you have to look at it in the context of the very recent adoption of the LDP and the Minister's desire to see the numbers in the LDP delivered.
Right. Okay. Is there anything anyone else wants? Is there anything else left on the agenda that anyone wants to say anything about?
Well, so if I can just, Mr. MacLeod again made the reference to the LDP, the report of examination Scottish ministers. After that, the paragraph I was referring to is 112 of the reporter's recommendation. I don't necessarily want to open up discussion on that point again at this point in time, but you can make your own assessment of what the reporters were saying there. Just in terms of Mr. MacLeod's attempt to say that reporters only considered the figures were out of date because they were going to be met anyway. I mean, I think the reality is the figures are either out of date or they are not. It's that interpretation, and the reporters clearly found that the figures were out of date, so therefore had to look at a different way of doing that calculation, and that is our suggestion to you, sir, that the figures are out of date, so you need to look at what you do in those circumstances, and the council's consistent position has been you need to go and look at the up-to-date assessment of demand for housing, and that is set out in the Honda. And I'll just suffering the cold here. The final thing from me on that point, I mean, what we haven't discussed to significant extent in the discussion so far are actually completions. And ultimately, that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to build houses for people that need houses. We're not trying to allocate land for some anticipated demand that has never been proven by any evidential base or up-to-date evidential base, and that the council would always point to the need to look at completions. That there is no deficiency in the land supply. That is the council's position. If house builders want to build houses, that there is enough land there for them to do so, for all the reasons that we've set out earlier on. The fact that they're not delivering those completions is not, in the council's view, a result of any deficiency in the land supply or shortfall of action by the council in the past. It's because, for whatever reason, the house builders are not building those houses. And that's what you have to assess, or what the reason for that will be.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's dealt with in the cases that you're referring to, isn't it? It's considered in the South East Wedge case. It's considered in the Uphall case. The reporter considered there that there were other factors at play, but that a shortfall in allocations was one of the factors, was it not?
Well, the reporters have found that the council does not have control over completions, insofar as it's not the housing delivery company. We can deliver our own completions, but allocation of land and completion of houses are different things. The council has control over one of them, but no control over the latter. And what we see is that as sites are granted on appeal, it doesn't. There's no evidence to suggest that is having a step change in terms of the number of house completions that are delivered, because there is a mismatch. There's a disconnect between the two. Simply allocating land doesn't guarantee that houses will be built, and that's the challenge of only looking at one side of the equation.
Mr. McLeod, do you want to round off?
Yes, sir. So two points. One that we covered already. Mr. McCorriston is correct that the council is not in control of actual completions unless it is the developer itself. That is the reason that the minister required the action programme to be reviewed every year, so the council could see what was happening, and if required, take action to ensure the early delivery of allocated sites. The expectation being that if the action programme showed that there was slowdown in activity or infrastructure constraints in the way, council might be able to help with it, and if it couldn't help with it, then policy how-to would kick in. And I'll finish with one word, which is Gaviside, and we'll come on to discuss that in the education section in due course. Gaviside is an effective site in the council's housing land audit. It is, however, for all practical purposes, constrained by a lack of education infrastructure, which the council is responsible for delivering. And we'll no doubt come back to discuss that in a bit of detail in due course.
I appreciate that Mr. McCorriston might want to say something about that, but I think we can leave that for another day. Okay, well, thanks everyone for your help on this. That was a helpful discussion from my point of view. I hope it was useful. I did have a further point on the agenda, which was to whether there's anything further procedural that we need to discuss. And I wonder if the council and the appellant have yet managed to discuss a further date for the hearing on education and on the rest of NPF4.
So just to clarify that Mr. Watson and myself had a discussion late last week, and so we're going to start discussing the theoretical information that we may prepare. Because this matters. But no, we have not fixed a date that would be available, and it would be for the council to confirm what date is appropriate.
Right. Okay. Well, I take it you'll continue discussion, and we'll hear from you. It would be very helpful to hear from you fairly shortly, because I would, as I say, I would like to give other interested parties notice of that
Of course.
hearing, so that they can make any comments they wish to make on NPF4. There's a slightly awkward overlap because we've discussed the revised draft of NPF4, but I mean, I think it was inevitable in the way that we were dealing with things, and talking about housing first. I think if we can, if you're able to come back to me fairly soon with a date, and we can simply deal with any anomalies that arise in the light of what people submit in terms of written statement, because my proposal was simply to allow interested parties to comment on the effect that the revised draft, or possibly the final adopted NPF4 has, the effect it has on their case. So, sorry, Mr. Salter.
Yeah, I'm on. Sorry, apologies.
Yeah.
Great, so,
Put your hand up. I thought you were asking to speak.
I was. I was going to say, well, why don't Mr. Watson and myself have a discussion this week, and we come back to you by Friday with potential date for a hearing, and that would also build in discussions between ourselves and Mr. Cotton about the education matters.
That would be excellent. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and that's great.
Are you thinking, sir, that the second hearing would be both education and other NPF4 issues?
Yes, that's what I had in mind. By the way, that's actually another point. I mean, we've obviously had quite a long discussion today. I did kind of wonder whether, given the complexity of education, it might be more amenable to an inquiry than a hearing, and that we might change to that at this point. But I don't know if I would seek parties' views on that, if there's if parties have views.
One of the issues that was discussed last week was the implication of the report which is going to the Council's committee this week, and whether there might be scope for some agreement being reached on a hypothetical basis about what implications that might have. I've got no difficulty with an inquiry if that's the way that you prefer to take the evidence. I wonder if the best course of action would be, we have a discussion with the council this week, we see sort of progress we can make, and we then give you an update at the end of the week, and you can then reflect on that, and we can decide whether, or you can decide whether you think an inquiry session is necessary or not.
Yeah, that sounds a sensible approach, if everyone's happy with that.
Yeah.
Yep. Good. Okay. Well, we'll decide on procedure in the light of your discussions. Yeah. Good. Okay. Well, thanks very much. Now I'll hear from you by the end of the week. That's great. Thanks very much. Bye now.